In April 1945, more than 2 million Soviet soldiers surrounded a city in ruins. Berlin, the capital of the Thousand-Year Reich, was about to become the stage for one of the bloodiest and most apocalyptic battles in human history. What happened inside those destroyed streets, in those dark basements, in those underground bunkers, defies all human comprehension. Women systematically raped, children armed with rocket launchers, old men shot for refusing to fight, soldiers committing mass suicide, and a maddened dictator who, from the depths of his concrete shelter, ordered the total destruction of his own people. But the most chilling part of this history is not the statistics or the dates, it is the voices of those who were there. Soviet soldiers who wrote letters to their mothers, describing scenes they could never forget. German women who documented in secret diaries the horrors they endured. Children who survived to tell how they saw their families die. Nazi officers who left testimonies of the final hours of the Third Reich, and civilians trapped in a hell they had not chosen. For decades, many of these testimonies remained hidden. Some were censored by the Soviets, others were silenced by shame, and many more were lost along with those who lived them. But today, 80 years later, those voices can finally be heard, and what they reveal is more shocking, more brutal, and more human than any history book could convey. Before you settle in, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world. What did the soldiers of the Red Army feel when they finally stepped onto the streets of the enemy capital? What went through the minds of the German defenders, many of them teenagers, as they watched an unstoppable human tide advance? How did the women of Berlin survive the darkest weeks of their lives? And what really happened in Hitler's bunker during his final hours? This is the fall of Berlin told by those who were there. To understand what happened in April 1945, we must go back a few months. In late 1944, the German Reich was crumbling on all fronts. In the West, the Allies had liberated France and were advancing toward the Rhine. In the East, the Red Army had expelled the Germans from the Soviet Union and now occupied Poland, drawing dangerously close to the borders of the Reich. But Hitler refused to accept reality. In his East Prussian headquarters, known as the Wolf's Lair, the German dictator lived in a fantasy world. He moved non-existent divisions on maps. He ordered impossible counter-offensives, and he punished with death any general who dared to mention the word retreat. Karl Köhler, the chief of the General Staff of the Luftwaffe, left a revealing testimony of those days. The Führer lived completely disconnected from reality. When we informed him about the real situation at the front, he accused us of defeatism. When we showed him the figures of our losses, he said they were exaggerations by cowards. He had lost all contact with the outside world. The Germans living in the east of the country knew that catastrophe was approaching. Refugees fleeing East Prussia brought stories of terror. They told what Soviet soldiers did in the German villages they captured. They spoke of mass rapes, murders, and fires. And although Nazi propaganda had exaggerated many things for years, this time the stories were true. Laura Walb, a 17-year-old German girl, wrote in her diary on January 21st, 1945, "Today more refugees arrived from the east. A woman told me that the Russians entered her village and raped all the women, including her 60-year-old mother. Then they burned the houses with the people inside. I don't know whether to believe her, but the terror in her eyes was real." Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin was planning the final blow. The Soviet dictator had summoned his two best marshals, Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, for a decisive meeting. The question was simple. Who would have the honor of capturing Berlin? Zhukov was the hero of Stalingrad, the defender of Moscow, the most famous general in the Soviet Union. Konev was his rival, equally talented but less known. Stalin, with his characteristic cruelty, decided to pit them against each other. He divided the front into two sectors and told them that the first to reach Berlin would take the glory. "Comrades," Stalin said, according to Zhukov's memoirs, "the race to Berlin has begun. I don't care how you do it, but I want the red flag flying over the Reichstag before the 1st of May. The 1st of May was Labor Day, the most sacred date on the Soviet calendar. Stalin wanted to celebrate it with the fall of the Nazi capital, and he was willing to sacrifice as many lives as necessary to achieve it. But what did the Soviet soldiers know about the city they were about to conquer? And what did they feel towards the Germans, who had invaded their homeland, destroyed their cities, and murdered millions of their compatriots? To answer these questions, we must listen to their own voices. Vasily Grossman was one of the Soviet Union's most famous war correspondents. He had followed the Red Army from Stalingrad to the gates of Berlin, documenting everything he saw in his notebooks. His writings, censored for decades by the Soviet regime, offer a unique view of what the soldiers thought and felt. April 1945, Grossman wrote, "We are a few kilometers from Berlin. The soldiers cannot believe it. After 4 years of war, after millions of deaths, after so much suffering, we are finally going to enter the beast's lair. The mood is difficult to describe. There is joy, of course, but there is also a thirst for revenge that frightens me. That thirst for revenge had deep roots. The Soviet soldiers had seen what the Germans had done in their country. They had found the corpses of their families in mass graves. They had liberated villages where not a single living inhabitant remained. They had discovered the extermination camps, the gas chambers, the crematorium ovens. Ilya Ehrenburg, the most influential propagandist of the Soviet Union, had spent years fueling that hatred. His articles, distributed to millions of soldiers, left no room for ambiguity. Kill the German, he wrote over and over again. Every time you see a German, kill him. Do not count the days. Do not count the kilometers. Count only one thing, the Germans you have killed. These words had terrible consequences. Although the Soviet High Command tried to impose some discipline, the desire for revenge was too strong, and when the Red Army finally entered German territory, a wave of violence began that would scar the civilian population forever. But not all Soviet soldiers were the same. Among them were men of profound humanity, who tried to protect civilians, who were horrified by the excesses of their comrades, who never forgot that the real fight was against Nazism, not against the German people. Leonid Rabachev, a young Soviet lieutenant, wrote decades later about what he witnessed in Germany. "I saw things that shame me to this day. I saw soldiers behave like beasts, but I also saw others who risked their lives to protect German women and children. War brings out the worst and the best in human beings. And in those days, I saw both." As the Red Army prepared for the final assault, Berlin was turning into a fortress. Or at least, that is what Hitler pretended. In reality, the situation in the German capital was desperate. Most of the regular army had been destroyed or was trapped on other fronts. The armament factories had been bombed to destruction. Food supplies were running out, and the civilian population, exhausted after years of Allied bombings, lived in a state of permanent terror. But Hitler did not want to hear bad news. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments of the Reich, left a chilling testimony of his last conversation with Hitler about the defense of Berlin. "I told him the war was lost. I showed him the figures. I explained that we had no fuel, no ammunition, no men. He looked at me with those empty eyes he had developed in recent months and said, 'If the war is lost, the German people will also perish. There is no need to worry about what they need to survive. On the contrary, it is better to destroy even that, because the nation will have proven to be the weaker one, and the future belongs solely to the stronger nation of the East.' This order, known as the Nero Decree, demanded the destruction of all German infrastructure, factories, bridges, electrical grids, water systems, anything that could be useful to the enemy. Hitler was willing to condemn his own people to die of hunger and thirst, just to deny any victory to the Allies. Speer, in a rare act of disobedience, secretly sabotaged these orders. He convinced local commanders to ignore the destruction instructions, and thanks to him, much of the German infrastructure survived the war. But this act of humanity could not save Berlin from what was coming. The defense of the city was entrusted to General Helmut Weidlin, a competent officer who knew perfectly well that his mission was impossible. Under his theoretical command were about 45,000 regular soldiers, mostly exhausted veterans from the Eastern Front. To these were added about 40,000 members of the Volkssturm, the popular militia made up of old men and teenagers. And finally, there were several thousand members of the Hitler Youth, some of them barely 12 years old. Weidlin wrote after the war, "When I saw my defenders, I knew everything was lost. I had 60-year-old men who could barely hold a rifle. I had 14-year-old boys who had never fired a weapon in their lives. And these men were supposed to stop the most powerful army in the world. But what did those child soldiers think? What did they feel as they prepared to die for a regime that had indoctrinated them since childhood?" Armin Lehmann was 16 years old in April 1945. He was an enthusiastic member of the Hitler Youth, convinced that the Führer was a demigod, and that Germany would win the war thanks to the miracle weapons that propaganda constantly promised. Decades later, Lehmann wrote his memoirs, offering a unique vision of the last days of the Reich from the perspective of an indoctrinated teenager. "We had been taught to believe. We believed everything they told us. We believed the Russians were subhuman. We believed the Führer had a secret plan for victory. We believed that dying for Germany was the highest honor possible. When they gave us uniforms and sent us to the barricades, we were proud. We were not afraid, or if we were, we did not admit it." Lehmann was assigned as a courier to Hitler's bunker, which allowed him to witness the dictator's final weeks. What he saw there destroyed all his illusions. "I saw Hitler for the first time on April 20th, his birthday. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was the man I adored, the invincible leader they had described to us for years. But what I saw was a trembling, hunched old man, with his left hand constantly shaking. He looked like a ghost. In that moment, something started to break inside me. But while some teenagers like Lehmann began to question their faith, others remained firmly convinced. The Hitler Youth had been indoctrinated for years with a lethal mix of propaganda, patriotism, and religious fanaticism. For many of them, dying fighting was preferable to living in a world without Hitler. Dieter Borkowski, another young Berliner, left a different testimony. "We were afraid, but we also had hope. They had promised us that the miracle weapons would arrive soon, that the Americans would join us against the Russians, that the Führer had a secret plan. Clinging to those lies was easier than accepting the truth. The truth was that there was no plan. There were no miracle weapons. There was no possible salvation. There was only death waiting on every corner." On April 16th, 1945, at 4 a.m, the Red Army launched its final offensive against Berlin. The attack began with the most intense artillery bombardment of the war. More than 40,000 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously along a front of several kilometers. The noise was so deafening that soldiers kilometers away felt the earth vibrate under their feet. The sky lit up as if it were day, and the German line was enveloped in a hell of fire and steel. A Soviet soldier named Nikolai Inozemtsev wrote to his family that night, "I will never forget what I saw today. The entire sky was on fire. The Germans, poor devils, had no chance. When we advanced toward their positions, we found shattered bodies everywhere. Some were still alive, but so badly wounded that they begged us to kill them. This war is madness, but at least it will soon end." Zhukov's plan was simple but brutal. After the bombardment, his troops would cross the Oder River and advance directly toward Berlin. To light the way and blind the German defenders, he ordered the lighting of more than 140 anti-aircraft searchlights, creating a wall of blinding light. But the plan did not work as he expected. The Germans, although decimated, still resisted. The Seelow Heights, a chain of hills dominating the Oder Valley, had been heavily fortified, and the searchlights, instead of blinding the Germans, created a luminous fog that made it difficult for the attackers themselves to see. The result was a carnage. Zhukov, frustrated by the German resistance, ordered increasingly desperate frontal attacks. His soldiers advanced over minefields, under machine gun fire, without proper cover or support. Casualties were catastrophic. In 3 days of combat, the First Belarusian Front lost more than 30,000 men. A Soviet officer named Yevgeny Besanov left a heartbreaking testimony. "We sent our men to die for nothing. Bodies were piled so high that they served as cover for the next attackers. The ground was so soaked in blood that we slipped as we walked, and Zhukov kept ordering more attacks, always more attacks. I think he cared more about personal glory than the lives of his men." While Zhukov was bogged down at the Seelow Heights, Konev advanced further south. His front had encountered less resistance and was progressing rapidly toward Berlin. Stalin, always ready to manipulate his generals, called Zhukov to inform him that Konev was winning the race. Zhukov panicked, one of his staff officers recalled later. He started shouting contradictory orders. He threatened to shoot anyone who didn't advance. Stalin's pressure was driving him crazy. Finally, after 3 days of brutal combat, the Seelow Heights fell. The road to Berlin was open, and the Red Army began its final advance toward the capital of the Reich. But what did the Soviet soldiers find when they entered the suburbs of Berlin? And how did the civilian population react to their arrival? Berlin in April 1945 was a lunar landscape. Allied bombings had reduced large sections of the city to rubble. Buildings that were once proud symbols of Prussian power were now burned out shells. The streets were filled with craters, destroyed vehicles, and corpses no one had time to bury. But the most shocking thing was not the physical destruction. It was the state of mind of the population. After years of propaganda, many Berliners still believed in final victory. Others had lost all hope but followed orders out of fear of reprisals. And some, the most lucid, knew exactly what was coming and desperately tried to escape. Ursula von Kardorf, a German journalist who kept a secret diary during the war, wrote on April 20th, 1945, "It's the Führer's birthday." In other times, there would have been celebrations all over the city. Today, there is nothing. Only the sound of artillery getting closer and closer. Everyone knows the end is near, but no one dares to say it out loud. That same day, Hitler emerged from his bunker for the last time to inspect his defenders. Among them was a group of Hitler Youth members, teenagers who had been recruited to defend the city. Hitler, with his trembling hand, patted their cheeks and thanked them for their sacrifice. The scene was filmed and became one of the last images of the dictator. What the camera did not capture was what happened next. Many of those teenagers died in the following days, sacrificed in a pointless defense by a man who had already decided to commit suicide. For the civilians trapped in Berlin, the arrival of the Soviets meant one thing: terror. Nazi propaganda had spent years describing the soldiers of the Red Army as bloodthirsty, subhuman beasts. And although much of that propaganda was exaggerated, refugees from the East had brought stories confirming the worst fears. A German woman, who published her memoirs anonymously under the title A Woman in Berlin, left the most raw and honest testimony of what the women of the city suffered. April 21st, the Russians are in the suburbs. We can hear the shooting getting closer. We all know what is coming. We have prepared as best we can. Some women have dressed in old, dirty clothes, hoping to look as unattractive as possible. Others have hidden in basements and attics. But deep down, we all know there is no escape. What followed over the next few weeks was one of the largest waves of sexual violence in history. It is estimated that between 100,000 and 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers during the conquest of Germany, although the exact number will never be known. Thousands of them died during or after the assaults. Many more committed suicide. The author of A Woman in Berlin described her own experience with heartbreaking coldness. I was raped, not once but several times, by different soldiers. I feel nothing anymore. It's as if my body no longer belonged to me. The other women say the same. We have learned to dissociate. It is the only way to survive. But it would be unfair to blame all Soviet soldiers. Many of them behaved with humanity. Some even risked their lives to protect civilians from their own comrades. And the Soviet High Command, albeit belatedly, tried to impose discipline. Lev Kopelev, a Soviet officer who would later become a famous dissident, left a testimony of his efforts to stop the abuses. I tried to protect the German women. I confronted soldiers who wanted to rape them. They threatened to kill me. But I couldn't just stand by. We had come to free the world from Nazism, not to turn into monsters ourselves. Kopelev was arrested shortly after for showing compassion to the enemy and spent years in the Soviet Gulag. His story illustrates the tragedy of good men caught in times of monstrosity. As Soviet troops fought their way into the center of the city, the fighting became increasingly brutal. Every street, every building, every basement became a battlefield. The Germans, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the desperation of the doomed. Heinrich Rau, a Wehrmacht soldier who survived the battle, described the urban combat. There was no front line. The Russians could be in the next street, in the building across the way, even on the floor above. You never knew where the next attack would come from. You fired at any shadow that moved, and you prayed that the next bullet wasn't meant for you. The Soviets had learned from their previous mistakes. Instead of advancing through the streets exposed to enemy fire, they carved a path through the buildings. They knocked down interior walls, crossed basements, used the sewer system. It was nightmare combat, hand to hand, in the dark. A Soviet sergeant named Alexei Smirnov left a testimony of this struggle. Every room was a potential trap. You threw a grenade before entering. You shot first and asked questions later. We lost a lot of good men in those buildings, but the Germans lost more. The fighting was especially intense around strategic points: the Reichstag, the Reich Chancellery, the zoo, where there were fortified anti-aircraft towers, and the bridges over the Spree River. In each of these places, the battles lasted for days, leaving piles of corpses from both sides. But perhaps the most tragic combats were those involving the young German defenders. Hitler Youth members, armed with Panzerfausts, anti-tank rocket launchers, were sent to face Soviet armor. Many of them didn't even know how to use their weapons, and those who did rarely survived the shot. Helmut Altner, a 17-year-old German boy, left a diary of his experiences. Today, I fired my first Panzerfaust at a Russian tank. I hit it. The tank exploded. I should have felt proud, but I only felt nauseous. Inside that tank were men who probably had families, mothers, children, and I killed them. For what? To defend a bunker where a madman waits for death. Altner survived the war, but his words reveal the crisis of faith many young Germans experienced in those final days. The ideology that had been drilled into them for years was crumbling under the weight of reality. And what was happening meanwhile in the Führer's bunker? What was Hitler doing while his capital burned? The Führer bunker was a concrete labyrinth located beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Built to withstand a nuclear attack, it had become the final refuge for the dictator and his inner circle. There, 20 meters underground, Hitler spent his last days surrounded by obsolete maps, defeated generals, and officials competing for his favor. Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal secretary, left one of the most detailed testimonies of life in the bunker. Her memoirs, published decades later, offer a disturbing glimpse into the dictator's final days. The bunker was a horrible place. It was always hot because the ventilation system didn't work well. The air was stale and smelled of sweat, fear, and desperation. The concrete walls seemed to close in on us, and in the centre of it all was Hitler, increasingly emaciated, trembling more and more disconnected from reality. Junger described how Hitler spent hours studying maps and giving orders to armies that no longer existed. He spoke of impossible counter-offensives, of reinforcements that would never arrive, of victories that existed only in his imagination. His generals, terrified, nodded at everything he said. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." That way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help the video's engagement, okay? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so YouTube keeps recommending our videos to you. No one dared to contradict him, Junger recalled. The last person who had tried, General Guderian, had been dismissed. Anyone who mentioned the possibility of defeat was accused of treason. So everyone lied. Everyone pretended things were going well. And Hitler, perhaps, believed his own lies. But there were moments of lucidity. Sometimes, especially at night, Hitler acknowledged that all was lost. In those moments, his fury turned to self-pity. They betrayed me, he told Junger one night. Everyone betrayed me. The generals, the politicians, the German people. They deserved a better leader. A leader who wouldn't have been so soft on them. These words reveal Hitler's pathological narcissism even in his final moments. To him, the catastrophe was not his fault. It was everyone else's fault. Germany did not deserve to survive because it had proven unworthy of his genius. On April 22nd, 1945, Hitler suffered what his assistants described as a nervous breakdown. During a military conference, he finally accepted that Berlin was lost. He shouted, cried, cursed his generals, and finally announced that he would remain in the city and commit suicide. Rochus Misch, the bunker's telecommunications operator, witnessed this scene. I had never seen him like that. He was completely out of control. He screamed that everyone had betrayed him, that the army had not fought hard enough, that Germany deserved to be destroyed. Then he suddenly calmed down and said in a quiet voice that he would kill himself. It was the most chilling thing I ever heard in my life. In the following days, Hitler put his affairs in order. He dictated his political testament, in which he blamed the Jews for the war and named Karl Donitz as his successor. He married Eva Braun, his longtime companion, in a brief and sad ceremony, and he waited for the end. Eva Braun, a woman who had spent her entire adult life in Hitler's shadow, finally had her moment of prominence. According to witnesses, she faced death with serenity, even with joy. She had chosen to die alongside the man she loved, regardless of what that man had done. Traudl Junger recalled her last conversation with Eva Braun. She told me she was happy, that she was finally the Führer's wife, even if only for a few hours, that she would rather die by his side than live without him. I couldn't understand it then. I still don't understand it now. On April 30th, 1945, while Soviet soldiers were fighting a few hundred meters from the bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. He shot himself in the right temple with his Walter pistol. Eva Braun, sitting next to him, had taken a cyanide capsule. The bodies were carried to the Chancellery Garden, where they were incinerated by the Führer's aides. Gasoline was scarce, so the process was incomplete. When the Soviets arrived a few days later, they found the partially burned remains. But how did the bunker's inhabitants react to Hitler's death? Erich Kempka, Hitler's personal chauffeur, left a testimony of that moment. When we learned that the Führer had died, there was a strange silence. No one cried. No one celebrated. It was as if we had all been holding our breath for years, and could finally exhale. But there was also fear. What would happen to us now? What would happen to our families? For some, Hitler's death was a release. Now they could try to surrender without being accused of treason. Many of the bunker's occupants began planning their escape, hoping the chaos of the final days would allow them to disappear among the civilian population. But for others, the Führer's death meant the end of the world they knew. Some chose to follow his example. The most tragic case was that of Josef and Magda Goebbels. The Reich's propaganda minister and his wife had brought their 6 children to the bunker, determined to all die together. On May 1st, after Hitler committed suicide, Magda Goebbels administered poison to her children while they slept. Helga, the eldest, was 12. Haida, the youngest, was only 4. Rochus Misch, the telecommunications operator, heard what happened. Mrs. Goebbels went up to the children's rooms. After a while, she came down. She was pale but calm. She looked at me and said nothing. But I knew what she had done. The children, the poor children. After killing their children, Joseph and Magda Goebbels committed suicide in the garden. Their bodies were also incinerated, though even more incompletely than those of Hitler. This act of infanticide has been debated by historians for decades. Was Magda Goebbels so indoctrinated that she preferred to kill her own children rather than see them live in a world without Nazism? Or did she act out of fear, believing the propaganda stories about what the Soviets would do to them? The truth probably includes elements of both explanations. What is indisputable is that those 6 innocent children were the final victims of Hitler's bunker. Their deaths symbolized the ultimate monstrosity of a regime that had built its power on the manipulation of the young. But what was happening outside the bunker while Hitler agonized in his underground shelter? The battle for Berlin continued with unimaginable ferocity. The last defenders of the city, a mix of desperate veterans and terrified teenagers, fought for every meter of ground. The Soviets, eager to end the war, attacked with everything they had. The main objective was the Reichstag, the German parliament building. Although it had not functioned as a parliament for years, Hitler had ruled by decree. Its symbolic value was immense. Stalin had specifically ordered that the red flag wave over the Reichstag for the 1st of May. The battle for the Reichstag began on April 29th and lasted more than 2 days. The defenders, a few hundred SS soldiers and sailors, fought with suicidal ferocity. The Soviets had to conquer the building room by room, floor by floor. Vasily Subotin, a Soviet sergeant who participated in the assault, left a testimony of those battles. "I never saw anything like it. The Germans fought like demons. Every staircase was a deadly trap. Every door could hide a machine gun. We lost many good men in that cursed building, but we kept going. We had to plant that flag." The famous photograph of the Soviet flag waving over the Reichstag was taken on May 2nd, 1945, after the last defenders surrendered or died. However, the Soviets insisted that the flag had been planted on April 30th to meet Stalin's deadline. The image became one of the most iconic symbols of the Second World War, although historians now know it was partially staged. The soldiers who planted the flag, Meliton Kantaria and Mikhail Yegorov, became heroes of the Soviet Union. But behind the glory was a grimmer reality. Dozens of other soldiers had died trying to perform the exact same act in the preceding hours. The surrender of Berlin took place on May 2nd, 1945. General Weidlin, the commander of the defense, signed the capitulation in the early hours of the morning. Organized fighting ceased, although there were pockets of resistance that continued fighting for days. For the Soviet soldiers, the victory was bittersweet. They had achieved their objective, but at a terrible cost. It is estimated that more than 80,000 Soviet soldiers died in the Battle of Berlin, with another 250,000 wounded. German casualties, both military and civilian, were equally devastating. A Soviet soldier named Yuri Rytov wrote to his mother on Victory Day, "We won. Berlin is ours. But I cannot celebrate. I have seen too much death. I have lost too many friends. And I know this victory will not bring any of them back. For the German civilians, the end of the fighting did not mean the end of the suffering. Rapes and looting continued for weeks. Food was scarce. The water was contaminated. Diseases spread through overcrowded shelters. The anonymous author of A Woman in Berlin described the days following the surrender. The fighting has ended, but the terror continues. The Russians still come at night. They still take the women. The only difference is that now there are no bombings. I can hear the screams more clearly. But gradually, very gradually, things began to stabilize. The Soviet High Command imposed stricter discipline. Food distribution points were established. The rubble began to be cleared, and life somehow continued. What do we learn from the testimonies of those who were at the fall of Berlin? What do these voices tell us about human nature, about war, about good and evil? Perhaps the most striking thing is the complexity they reveal. There were no absolute good guys or absolute bad guys in the Battle of Berlin. There were Soviet soldiers who committed terrible atrocities, but there were also others who risked their lives to protect civilians. There were Germans who fought to the bitter end for a criminal regime, but there were also others who tried to save lives amidst the chaos. The testimonies also reveal the ease with which human beings can dehumanize others. The Soviet soldiers who raped German women had been conditioned for years to see Germans as subhuman. The young Germans who died defending Berlin had been indoctrinated since childhood to hate and fear the Soviets. Both groups were victims of systems that had turned them into instruments of violence. And perhaps most importantly, the testimonies remind us that behind the statistics are real people. Each of the millions who died in the Second World War was an individual with hopes, fears, loves, and dreams. Their voices, preserved in diaries, letters, and memoirs, force us to confront the human reality of history. To fully understand the fall of Berlin, we must also examine what happened in the days and weeks leading up to it on the front. The testimonies of soldiers on both sides reveal a relentless progression toward the final catastrophe. In March 1945, as the Red Army prepared for its final offensive, the situation on the German front was one of absolute chaos. Units were disorganized, poorly equipped, and demoralized. Supplies were not arriving. Communication with the High Command was erratic, and rumors of what awaited them if they were taken prisoner fueled paralyzing terror. Friedrich von Mellenthin, a German panzer general, left a testimony of the situation. In March 1945, I knew all was lost. Our divisions existed only on paper. What we called battalions were often groups of 20 or 30 exhausted men. We had no fuel for our tanks. We had no ammunition for our guns, and facing us was an army of millions. But the Nazi machine kept functioning, at least when it came to repression. The SS and the Gestapo roamed the lines, executing anyone who spoke of surrender. Summary military courts condemned soldiers to death for cowardice or defeatism, and the bodies of the executed were displayed with signs warning, "This is how traitors end up." Karl Donitz, the admiral Hitler would name as his successor, described this madness. In the final months of the war, we killed more German soldiers than the enemy could have killed. We shot men for surrendering when they had no other choice. We hanged teenagers for trying to return to their homes. It was a murderous madness. On the other side of the front, the Red Army advanced with relentless determination. The Soviet soldiers had suffered 4 years of brutal war. They had lost millions of comrades. They had liberated cities where not a single building was left standing. And now, finally, they were about to enter the enemy's den. But along with determination, there was also exhaustion. The Soviet soldiers who reached the gates of Berlin had been fighting almost without rest since the summer of 1944. Many of them had not seen their families in years, and the trauma of what they had witnessed had hardened them in ways they themselves did not comprehend. Alexander Werf, a British correspondent who travelled with the Red Army, left a testimony of that exhaustion. The soldiers I met on the road to Berlin were not the same ones I had seen in Stalingrad. They were tired, not only physically but spiritually. They had seen too much death, too much suffering, too much cruelty. Some of them told me they felt nothing anymore. Neither joy for the victory, nor sadness for their dead comrades, just an immense emptiness. That emotional emptiness explains, in part, the excesses that would occur during the conquest of Berlin. Soldiers who had lost the capacity to feel compassion became instruments of blind vengeance, and in the chaos of urban battle, there was no one who could stop them. The offensive on the Oder, which began on April 16th, was one of the most massive military operations in history. The Soviets had concentrated over 2.5 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, and 41,600 pieces of artillery. It was an overwhelming force, designed to crush any resistance. But the Germans, though vastly outnumbered, did not surrender without a fight. The defences along the Oder had been prepared for months. Deep trenches, minefields, concrete bunkers, and camouflaged artillery positions awaited the attackers, and the defenders, though desperate, still had the advantage of the terrain. Helmut Waltz, a 19-year-old German soldier, left a testimony of the defence of the Oder. When the Soviet bombardment began, I thought the world was ending. The noise was so loud I couldn't hear my own screams. The earth shook so much I couldn't stand up. But when the bombardment stopped and the Russians began to advance, something strange happened. The fear disappeared. Only the determination to survive remained. Waltz survived the Battle of the Oder, but thousands of his comrades were not so lucky. The German defences, though initially effective, were eventually overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the Soviet attack. The reinforcements Hitler had promised never arrived, and when the lines broke, the road to Berlin lay open. The advance toward Berlin was a race against time for the Soviets. Stalin had set the 1st of May as the deadline for the city's capture, and his two main marshals, Zhukov and Konev, competed fiercely for the honour of planting the flag on the Reichstag. This rivalry had tragic consequences. Both commanders, anxious to arrive first, ordered hasty attacks that cost thousands of lives. Soldiers were sent against fortified positions without proper preparation. Tanks advanced down narrow streets, where they were easy targets for German rocket launchers, and the artillery bombarded indiscriminately, killing defenders and civilians alike. A Soviet colonel named Ivan Klimov left a testimony of this madness. We lost more men to haste than to German resistance. Zhukov wanted to arrive before Konev, and both wanted to satisfy Stalin. The price of their ambition was paid by the rank and file. The Germans, meanwhile, desperately tried to organise a coherent defence, but the chain of command was completely disorganised. Hitler, from his bunker, gave orders that bore no relation to the reality on the front. Generals on the ground ignored these orders and made their own decisions, and in the midst of the chaos, no one really knew who was in charge. Theodor Bucer, commander of the German Ninth Army, left a testimony of this confusion. I received contradictory orders 3 times a day. Hitler ordered me to counterattack to the north. Keitel ordered me to hold the position. Heinrici ordered me to retreat to the west. In the end, I did what seemed most sensible to me. I tried to save as many men as possible. As the Soviet encirclement tightened around Berlin, the situation for civilians became increasingly desperate. Air raid shelters, designed to protect the population from bombings, turned into death traps. Water was scarce, food was running out, and rumours about what the Soviets did to captured civilians fueled a growing panic. Hildegard Knef, a young actress who survived the battle, left a testimony of life in the shelters. We were hundreds of people crammed into a space designed for 50. The air was unbreathable. Children cried constantly. Old people died in silence, and sometimes hours passed before anyone noticed. Outside, we could hear the explosions and gunfire. Inside, we waited to die. The shelters offered no protection against what was to come. When the Soviets captured a building, they often searched the basements for hidden defenders. And when they found civilians, especially women, the consequences were frequently tragic. One particularly heartbreaking testimony comes from a German nurse who worked in a makeshift hospital. The Russians entered our shelter on April 28th. We were 30 women and a few elderly men. The soldiers separated us. They took the men outside. We heard shots. They took us women into different rooms. I cannot describe what happened next. I will only say that when they finished, 3 of us no longer wanted to live. These testimonies are difficult to read, but it is important that they are heard because they form part of the historical truth of the Second World War. The women of Berlin suffered atrocities that were silenced for decades, both in the East and in the West. Only in recent years, thanks to the courage of those who finally told their stories, has this truth begun to be recognized. Why did this wave of sexual violence occur? Historians have debated the causes for decades, and there is no simple answer. Part of the explanation lies in vengeance. The Soviet soldiers had seen what the Germans had done in their country. They had found the corpses of their relatives, the ruins of their homes, the mass graves of their neighbours. For many of them, raping German women was a way to return the suffering they had endured. A Soviet soldier named Vladimir Gelfand wrote in his diary, "The Germans raped our women. Now it's our turn. I feel no guilt. They started it." But vengeance doesn't explain everything. Propaganda, which had dehumanized the Germans for years, also played a role. Soviet soldiers had been conditioned to see the enemy as subhuman, as beasts deserving any punishment. And when they finally entered German territory, they acted according to that logic. Alcohol played a devastating role. Soviet soldiers found massive quantities of alcohol in German cellars and factories. The Soviet High Command, which could have banned its consumption, did nothing to stop it, and drunk soldiers lost the last vestiges of self-control. Finally, the lack of consequences allowed the abuses to continue. Although the Soviet military code theoretically forbade rape, in practice, perpetrators were rarely punished. Some officers even participated in the abuses, or tolerated them as a reward for their men. But it is important to remember that not all Soviet soldiers participated in these crimes. Many of them behaved with humanity and even risked their lives to protect civilians. These men, forgotten by history, deserve to be remembered just as much as the perpetrators deserve to be condemned. Amidst the chaos of battle, there were small acts of humanity that shone like glimpses of hope. A German woman named Margaret Bovary left a testimony of one of these moments. A young Russian soldier, maybe 18 years old, came to our door. We thought we were going to die, but he just wanted bread. We gave him the little we had. He took it, looked at us sadly, and said in terrible German, "War bad, everyone suffer." Then he left. I will never forget his eyes. Another testimony comes from a Soviet doctor who tried to organize medical care for wounded civilians. My superiors told me the Germans didn't deserve our help, but when I saw the wounded children, the desperate mothers, I couldn't follow that order. They were human beings like us. I treated as many as I could, Germans and Russians alike. These individual acts of kindness do not change the brutal nature of the conquest of Berlin, but they remind us that even in the worst moments of human history, there are always people who choose compassion over cruelty. The final days of April 1945 were a descent into hell. The fighting was now concentrated in the centre of Berlin, around the government buildings and monuments that symbolised the power of the Reich. The Tiergarten, the vast park in the heart of the city, had become a battlefield. The centuries-old trees had been cut down to build barricades. The paths where families strolled on Sundays were now filled with craters and corpses. And the zoo, where children had admired exotic animals, had turned into a fortress. The zoo's anti-aircraft towers, known as Flaktürme, were massive concrete structures designed to withstand any attack. Equipped with anti-aircraft guns and protected by walls several meters thick, they had become the last bastions of the German defense. Thousands of civilians had taken refuge inside, along with the remnants of military units. Karl Stich, a German artilleryman who defended one of the towers, left a testimony of those days. "We shot at anything that moved. The Russians came in waves, and we mowed them down wave after wave. But they never stopped. For every Russian we killed, 10 more appeared, and we were running out of ammunition, water, and hope." The civilians inside the towers lived a different nightmare. Crammed into unventilated spaces, without enough water or food, surrounded by the sounds of battle, they waited for an end that seemed inevitable. A young mother named Kata Heusermann left a testimony of that wait. "My son was 3 years old. He didn't understand what was happening. He kept asking why we couldn't go out to play, why there was so much noise, why Mommy was crying. I tried to explain it to him, but there is no way to explain the end of the world to a 3-year-old. While the battle raged on the surface, a different drama was unfolding in the depths of Hitler's bunker. The final days of the Third Reich were being witnessed by a small group of people who had chosen, or been forced, to remain with the dictator to the end. The atmosphere in the bunker was one of total unreality. While thousands died outside, inside formal meals were served, birthdays were celebrated, and plans were made for a future that would never arrive. Gerda Christian, one of Hitler's secretaries, described this surreal atmosphere. "It was like living in 2 different worlds. We could hear the explosions, feel the vibrations of the impacts. But inside the bunker, Hitler insisted on keeping up appearances. He dressed in his impeccable uniform. He demanded that meals be served on porcelain dishes. He talked about plans to rebuild Berlin after the war. It was complete madness. But occasionally reality penetrated the bunker. Messengers arrived with increasingly desperate news. Generals reported catastrophic losses, and the explosions were heard closer and closer. On April 22nd, when Hitler finally accepted that Berlin was lost, the atmosphere changed drastically. The facade of normality collapsed. Hitler shouted, cursed, cried, and then announced that he would stay in Berlin and commit suicide. This announcement triggered a wave of desperate departures. Many of the bunker's occupants tried to escape before it was too late. Some succeeded, getting lost among the millions of refugees fleeing westward. Others were captured by the Soviets, and some died trying. Those who remained in the bunker lived the last days of the Reich in a mix of terror and apathy. They knew death was probable, but the routine continued. Traudl Junge, the secretary who had remained by Hitler to the end, described those days. "Time lost all meaning. We didn't know if it was day or night. We didn't know what date it was. We only knew that every passing hour brought us closer to the end. Some of us prayed, others drank, others simply waited." On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun in a ceremony that was as brief as it was sad. The judge who officiated the wedding, a municipal official who had been pulled from a nearby shelter, could barely hide his nervousness. Traudl Junge left a testimony of the wedding. "It was the strangest ceremony I ever witnessed. Hitler and Eva stood before the judge, she in a black dress, he in his uniform. They signed the documents, they kissed briefly, and that was it. There was no celebration, no toast, no joy. It was the marriage of 2 people who knew they would be dead in a few hours." After the ceremony, Hitler dictated his political testament. In it, he blamed the Jews for the war, named his successors, and demanded that Germany continue the fight. It was the final act of propaganda by a man who had based his entire career on lies. On April 30th, 1945, around 3:30 in the afternoon, Adolf Hitler retired to his private rooms with Eva Braun. Those waiting outside heard a gunshot. Heinz Linger, Hitler's valet, was one of the first to enter the room. The Führer was sitting on the sofa, with his head tilted to the left. There was blood everywhere. Eva Braun was by his side, also dead, but with no visible wounds. She had taken poison. The smell of bitter almonds filled the room. The bodies were carried to the Chancellery Garden, where they were incinerated with gasoline. Hitler's aides had received strict instructions to ensure the Soviets could not exhibit his corpse as a trophy. Rochus Misch, the last survivor of the bunker, described the scene. I saw them carry the bodies up the stairs. I saw them place them in a bomb crater. I saw them pour gasoline on them. I saw them set them on fire. And then I saw the flames consume the remains of the man who had destroyed the world. But the cremation was not complete. Gasoline was scarce, and Hitler's aides had to abandon the task before the bodies were completely destroyed. When the Soviets arrived a few days later, they found the partially calcined remains in the Chancellery Garden. What did the Soviets do with those remains? And why did Stalin keep the final fate of Hitler's corpse a secret for years? These questions would remain unanswered for decades, fueling conspiracy theories and myths about the dictator's survival. While Hitler's body burned in the Chancellery Garden, the battle for Berlin entered its final phase, but the most intense fighting was yet to come. The Reichstag, the German parliament building, had become the supreme objective for the Soviets. Stalin had specifically ordered that the red flag fly over its dome for the 1st of May, the Soviet Labor Day. For the soldiers of the Red Army, capturing the Reichstag meant the final victory over fascism. But the defenders of the building were not willing to surrender without a fight. The Reichstag was defended by a heterogeneous mix of forces: SS soldiers, Kriegsmarine sailors, police officers, and Hitler Youth volunteers. Although they were only a few hundred, they fought with suicidal ferocity. They knew surrender likely meant death or captivity in Siberia. Stepan Neustroev, a Soviet captain who led one of the assaults on the Reichstag, left a testimony of those battles. I never saw such fanatical resistance. The Germans fought from every window, every staircase, every room. When we ran out of ammo, we fought with bayonets. When the bayonets broke, we fought with our hands. It was an absolute carnage. The assault on the Reichstag began on April 29th and lasted more than 48 hours. The Soviets attacked in waves, suffering catastrophic casualties, but advancing meter by meter. The Germans counterattacked desperately, regaining positions only to lose them again minutes later. A Soviet soldier named Mikhail Minin described the inside of the building during the fighting. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see more than 2 meters. The noise of explosions and gunfire was so loud you couldn't hear your own screams. The floor was covered in corpses, so many you had to walk over them. And the smell of blood, gunpowder, burnt flesh. I will never forget it. Sometime on April 30th or May 1st, sources differ. 2 Soviet soldiers managed to reach the roof of the Reichstag and plant a red flag. Their names were Meliton Kantaria and Mikhail Yegorov. They would become heroes of the Soviet Union, their faces immortalized on postage stamps and monuments. But the famous photograph of the flag over the Reichstag, one of the most iconic images of the 20th century, was not taken at that moment. It was staged by photographer Yevgeny Kaldai several days later when the fighting had ended. Kaldai revealed years later how he created the image. I carried the flag in my backpack. My tailor in Moscow had made it, using red tablecloths. When I got to the Reichstag, the fighting was over, but there was still smoke and fire everywhere. I found some soldiers and asked them to pose. We had to go up several times because the first photos didn't come out right. The image was also retouched before publication. One of the soldiers in the original photo was wearing 2 wristwatches, evidence of looting. Soviet censors erased one of the watches to preserve the heroic image of the Red Army. This manipulation does not detract from the historical importance of the capture of the Reichstag, but but it reminds us that even the most authentic images of history can be constructs, products of propaganda and politics. The formal surrender of Berlin occurred in the early hours of May 2nd, 1945. General Helmut Weidlin, commander of the city's defense, crossed the lines to negotiate with the Soviets. Weidlin left a testimony of that moment. "I was brought before General Chirikov. He asked me if I was willing to order a ceasefire. I said yes, that it made no sense to continue fighting. My men were exhausted, without ammunition, without hope. Signing the surrender was the hardest act of my life, but also the most necessary." The surrender order was broadcast by loudspeakers across the German lines, but not everyone obeyed. Some SS groups continued fighting for days, preferring to die rather than surrender. Others tried to escape westward, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British instead of the Soviets. For the civilians of Berlin, the surrender brought immediate relief followed by new horrors. The bombings had ended, but the rapes and looting continued for weeks. Only gradually, very gradually, did the Soviets impose order and life began to normalize. But what happened to the survivors of Hitler's bunker? What fate awaited those who had been closest to the dictator in his final days? The stories of the bunker's occupants after the war are as diverse as the people themselves. Some were captured and tried, others escaped and lived the rest of their lives in anonymity, and some committed suicide, following the example of their Führer. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, tried to escape the bunker on the night of May 1st to 2nd. For decades, his fate was speculated about. Some claimed to have seen him in South America. Others believed he had died during the escape. Only in 1972, when his remains were discovered near the Lehrte station in Berlin, was it confirmed that he had died that night, probably by biting a cyanide capsule when he was surrounded by the Soviets. Heinz Linner, Hitler's valet, who had incinerated his body, was captured by the Soviets and spent the next 10 years in prisoner camps. After his release, he wrote his memoirs, offering one of the most detailed accounts of the final days in the bunker. Traudl Junger, the secretary who had transcribed Hitler's will, escaped the bunker along with other survivors. She was briefly captured by the Soviets, but managed to escape during the chaos of the early days of the occupation. She lived the rest of her life in Germany, keeping silent about her experiences for decades. Only at the end of her life did she agree to tell her story, first in a memoir and later in the documentary Im Totenwinkel, Blind Spot. In an interview filmed shortly before her death in 2002, Junger reflected on her role in history. "For years I told myself that I was young, that I didn't know what was going on, that I had no choice. But then I learned about Sophie Scholl, a girl my exact same age, who was executed for resisting Nazism, and I realized there is always a choice. I simply didn't want to see it." Armin Lehmann, the young Hitler Youth courier, who had witnessed Hitler's last days, survived the war and eventually emigrated to the United States. There he became an advocate for peace and reconciliation, dedicating his life to warning about the dangers of extremism. In his memoirs, Lehmann described the moment his faith in Nazism finally crumbled. "It was when I saw the children die. Boys of 12, 13 years old, sent to fight against tanks with nothing but a rocket launcher. I saw them fall, one after another, while the adults who had sent them hid in their bunkers. In that moment, I knew that everything I had been taught was a lie, and I knew I would have to live with that truth for the rest of my life." Lehmann's words resonate especially when we consider the fate of the young German soldiers who defended Berlin. It is estimated that thousands of teenagers died in the battle, sacrificed by a regime that had corrupted their youth with hate and fanaticism. But the history of the fall of Berlin would not be complete without hearing the voices of those who suffered the most, the women. The book A Woman in Berlin, published anonymously in 1959 and later attributed to journalist Martha Hillers, offers the most raw and courageous testimony of what the city's women endured during the Soviet conquest. The author, with brutal honesty, describes how she and other women developed survival strategies. Some sought the protection of high-ranking Soviet officers, hoping that the presence of a powerful man would shield them from the rank and file. Others hid in attics and basements, risking starvation to avoid being found. "We learned to disconnect from our bodies," the author wrote. "It was the only way to survive. When you are being raped for the third time in one night, you cannot allow yourself to feel. You become an object, a thing, and you pray for it to end quickly." This testimony was so shocking that when it was published in Germany in the 1950s, it was rejected and condemned. Critics accused the author of sullying the honor of German women. The book was withdrawn from circulation and not republished until 2003, when it was finally recognized as an invaluable historical document. Why was it silenced for so long? And what does this silence tell us about how societies process collective trauma? The silence surrounding the experiences of the women of Berlin was part of a broader pattern. In post-war Germany, both in the East and the West, there was little room to talk about German victimization. The Germans had been the perpetrators of the Holocaust, the aggressors who had unleashed the most destructive war in history. In that context, stories of German suffering were considered politically inconvenient. In East Germany, under Soviet control, talking about the rapes was especially dangerous. The Soviets were presented as heroic liberators, not as perpetrators of war crimes. Anyone who questioned this narrative risked their freedom or their life. In West Germany, the need to build a new democratic identity also contributed to the silence. West Germans were busy distancing themselves from the Nazi past, proving their commitment to Western values. Stories of German victimization did not fit into that project. Only decades later, when a new generation began to ask questions, did these stories start to come to light. And what they revealed was the moral complexity of the war, where the categories of victim and perpetrator often overlapped in uncomfortable ways. While the women of Berlin suffered in silence, the Soviet soldiers also carried their own traumas. The war had lasted almost 4 years. Millions of Soviets had died. Entire cities had been destroyed. And the soldiers who finally reached Berlin had witnessed atrocities that no human being should see. Vasily Grossman, the war correspondent, wrote about the psychological state of the Soviet soldiers in the final days of the war. "These men have seen too much. They have killed too much. They have lost too much. When I look into their eyes, I see something that frightens me. It's not hate, exactly. It's something colder, emptier. It's as if a part of them died along with their comrades." Grossman also documented the efforts of some officers to impose discipline and stop the abuses. "I saw a colonel shoot one of his own men for raping a German woman. The soldier fell dead, and the colonel turned to the others and said, 'We are the Red Army, not a gang of criminals.' But such acts of justice were rare, too rare. The Soviet soldiers who returned home after the war often found they could not talk about what they had seen and done. Stalin's regime had no interest in the psychological trauma of its veterans. They were expected to return to work, to rebuild the country, to move forward. The silent suffering of millions of Soviet veterans is another story that remains largely untold. What lessons can we draw from the fall of Berlin? And why is it important to remember these testimonies 80 years later? The first lesson is about the nature of total war. The Battle of Berlin was not just a clash between armies. It was a catastrophe that engulfed an entire civilian population, subjecting them to horrors that defy imagination. The testimonies of those who were there remind us that war is never abstract. It always has a human cost measured in destroyed lives, separated families, traumas passed down from generation to generation. The second lesson is about propaganda and dehumanization. Both the Nazis and the Soviets had spent years convincing their populations that the enemy was subhuman, beasts, who deserve no compassion. This dehumanization facilitated atrocities on both sides. The testimonies remind us that when we stop seeing the other as human, we are capable of committing the worst crimes. The third lesson is about moral complexity. In the fall of Berlin, there were no absolute good guys or absolute bad guys. There were victims who were also perpetrators. There were perpetrators who were also victims. There were acts of unimaginable cruelty and acts of unexpected kindness. The testimonies force us to confront this complexity, to resist the temptation to simplify history into comfortable categories. And the fourth lesson is about the importance of memory. For decades, many of these stories were silenced out of shame, out of politics, out of the desire to move on. But silence does not heal wounds. Only by passing them on honestly, by listening to those who were there, can we hope to learn from them. Now we must go back to look deeper into the days leading up to the final assault, when the fate of millions was being decided on the battlefields surrounding the German capital. In the weeks before the Oder offensive, the Red Army had amassed a force of truly colossal dimensions. The logistical preparations were on a scale unprecedented in military history. Trains loaded with ammunition, fuel, and supplies arrived day and night at the concentration zones. Tens of thousands of vehicles were gathered in forests and villages, camouflaged against German reconnaissance planes. A Soviet logistics officer named Pavel Sudoplatov left a testimony of these preparations. I had never seen anything like it. We had enough ammunition to fire for weeks without stopping, enough fuel for our tanks to reach the Atlantic, enough food to feed a small country. It was the final effort of a nation that had sacrificed everything for victory. The Soviet soldiers waiting for the attack order lived in a state of extreme tension. They knew the battle for Berlin would be brutal. Many of them did not expect to survive, but they also knew they were about to achieve what they had dreamed of during 4 years of war, the final destruction of the enemy who had invaded their homeland. A Soviet sergeant named Anatoly Mereshko wrote to his mother the night before the attack. "Dear Mama, tomorrow the final battle begins. If I do not write again, you will know what happened. But I want you to know I am not afraid. I have waited for this moment since the Germans burned our house and killed Papa. Tomorrow, finally, there will be justice." Mereshko survived the war. His letter, found decades later among his mother's belongings, offers a window into the mindset of Soviet soldiers on the eve of the final assault. On the other side of the line, the German defenders knew they faced an overwhelming force. German intelligence had detected the Soviet buildup, but there was nothing they could do about it. The Reich's reserves were exhausted. The reinforcements promised by Hitler existed only in his imagination. Gotthard Heinrici, the commander of Army Group Vistula, defending the sector facing Berlin, was one of the few German generals who still retained some realism. He had tried to warn Hitler about the impossibility of defending the capital, but his warnings had been ignored. In his diary, Heinrici wrote, "The Führer lives in a fantasy world. He talks about counter-offensives and splitting the enemy when we barely have enough men to hold a defensive line. My divisions exist only on paper. What they call regiments are often groups of 50 or 100 exhausted men, and facing us are millions of Russians with thousands of tanks." Heinrici did what he could to prepare his defences. He ordered the evacuation of the first line of trenches, right before the Soviet bombardment, saving thousands of his men from destruction. But he knew these tactics could only delay the inevitable. "My only goal now," he wrote, "is to save as many men as possible, not to win a war that is already lost, but so they can return to their families when it is all over." The bombardment that began at 4 a.m. on April 16th, 1945, was one of the most intense in the history of warfare. More than 1 million artillery shells fell on the German positions in less than an hour. The noise was so deafening that soldiers miles away were temporarily deafened. A German soldier named Fritz Wass, who survived the bombardment, left this testimony. "It was as if the world was ending. The ground shook so violently you couldn't stay on your feet. The air was filled with dirt, metal fragments, pieces of human bodies. The men next to me simply vanished, literally vanished. pulverized by the explosions. I huddled at the bottom of my trench and prayed for the first time in my life. When the bombardment ended and the Soviet infantry began to advance, the surviving defenders emerged from their positions to face the enemy. What followed was a butchery of biblical proportions. The Silo Heights, the most fortified point of the German defense, became the scene of some of the most intense fighting of the entire war. The Soviets attacked in waves, taking terrible casualties, but moving inexorably forward. The Germans counterattacked desperately, retaking positions only to lose them again hours later. A Soviet officer named Boris Gorbatov described the fighting. "I never saw so many dead in such a small space." The bodies piled so high, they served as barricades for the next attackers. The ground was so soaked in blood, it had turned to red mud. And yet we kept going. We had to keep going. Berlin was waiting. But what motivated the soldiers on both sides to keep fighting in such horrendous conditions? What kept them moving forward or resisting when everything seemed lost? For the Soviets, the motivations were multiple. There was patriotism, the desire to avenge the atrocities committed by the Germans on Soviet soil. There was the pressure of the political system, which punished cowardice with death or the Gulag. And there was the simple instinct for survival. In assault units, it was often safer to advance than to retreat. But there was also something deeper. Many Soviet soldiers genuinely believed they were fighting for a better world. Propaganda had convinced them that victory over fascism would bring an era of peace and prosperity. And although that promise would turn out to be false for many of them, at that moment it gave them the strength to carry on. A Soviet soldier named Viktor Astafyev, who would later become a famous writer, reflected on those motivations. "We fought for everything and for nothing, for our families and for abstractions, for revenge and for hope, out of fear and out of courage. War is too complicated to explain with a single motivation. Every soldier had his own reasons, and each of us carried our own demons." For the Germans, the motivations were equally complex. Many still believed in Nazi propaganda, convinced that victory was possible if they fought with enough determination. Others fought out of fear of the Soviets, whose atrocities had been magnified by propaganda, and fear of their own superiors, who executed anyone showing signs of surrender. But for many German soldiers, especially the veterans who had seen the reality of war, the primary motivation was simply to protect their families. They knew that every day they delayed the Soviet advance was one more day their loved ones had to flee west. Heinrich Böll, the future Nobel Prize winner in literature, who served as a German soldier, wrote years later, "We didn't fight for Hitler. By that point, most of us hated him. We fought because we had no alternative, because surrendering probably meant death, and because behind us were our mothers, our sisters, our wives. Every hour we kept them occupied was an hour more for them to escape." While soldiers died at the front, the civilian population of Berlin lived its own horrors. Allied bombings had destroyed much of the city, but life continued in the basements and shelters. Women stood in line for hours to get the meagre food rations. The elderly tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, and children played in the ruins, oblivious to the impending catastrophe. Ingeborg Ochsenknecht, an 8-year-old girl in 1945, left a testimony of those days decades later. "We didn't understand what was happening. To us, the war was normal. We didn't know anything else. We played war in the ruins. We collected shrapnel fragments as if they were treasures. And when the sirens sounded, we ran to the shelter as if it were a game. Only later did I understand the horror of what we lived through." The air raid shelters of Berlin were a world apart. Some were elaborate concrete structures, designed to withstand the heaviest bombings. Others were simple building basements, with little real protection. In both cases, they became temporary communities, where strangers shared fear, hunger, and hope. Helga Schneider, another survivor, described life in the shelters. "We were like a big dysfunctional family. People of all social classes, all ages, all backgrounds, forced to live together in a tiny space. There were fights over food, over space, over air, but there was also solidarity. We shared the little we had. We took care of each other's children. In the worst moments, the best of humanity sometimes emerged. But not everyone experienced the same solidarity. Refugees from the East, who had fled the Soviets, were often met with hostility by Berliners. They were seen as a burden, as competition for scarce resources. And the stories they brought of Soviet atrocities, while true, were sometimes dismissed as exaggerations. An East Prussian refugee named Erika von Hornstein left a testimony of this reception. We arrived in Berlin thinking we would find safety, but the Berliners looked at us with contempt. They called us Polacken, an insult. They said we had abandoned our lands without a fight. They didn't understand. They hadn't seen what we had seen. What Hornstein and other refugees had seen was the prelude to what awaited Berlin. The mass rapes, murders, and fires that had ravaged the eastern provinces were now approaching the capital. But many Berliners refused to believe it, convinced that propaganda had exaggerated the dangers. This denial would have tragic consequences. When the Soviets finally arrived, many women were completely unprepared for what awaited them. They had not taken precautions. They had not found hiding places. They had not established protection networks. And when the wave of violence hit, it caught them off guard. How did the women who did understand the danger prepare? And what survival strategies did they develop? The testimonies reveal a variety of tactics. Some women tried to look as unattractive as possible. They dressed in dirty, torn clothes, smeared ash on their faces, pretended to be sick or pregnant. Others hid in the most unlikely places, behind false walls, in wells, in dark corners of attics and basements. Margaret Boveri, the journalist who survived the battle, described these preparations. We knew what was coming. The women who had escaped from the East had told us everything, so we prepared as best we could. We hid the most attractive young girls. We prepared places to take refuge when the Russians arrived. But deep down, we knew no preparation would be enough. One of the most controversial strategies was what some women called seeking protection. When it became clear that rapes were inevitable, some women sought the protection of a specific Soviet officer, hoping his presence would shield them from the enlisted men. The author of A Woman in Berlin described this tactic with brutal honesty. It's a form of prostitution, yes, but it is prostitution for survival. When you have to choose between being raped by 20 different soldiers or being the friend of a major who protects you, the choice is obvious. It is not a moral choice. It is a survival choice. This honesty was one of the reasons why the book was so controversial when published. It challenged the narrative of German women as passive victims, showing them as active agents doing what was necessary to survive. But survival strategies didn't always work. Many women, despite their precautions, were found and raped. Some were violated multiple times, by different soldiers, over days or weeks. The trauma of these experiences marked generations of German women. Many never spoke of what had happened to them, not even with their closest families. Silence was a form of protection, a way to move forward without reliving the horror. A German psychologist named Ingrid Schmidt-Harzbach, who studied the survivors decades later, wrote, "These women developed extraordinary survival mechanisms. They learned to compartmentalize their experiences, to separate them from the rest of their lives. But the trauma did not disappear. It emerged in the form of depression, anxiety, difficulties in intimate relationships, and it was often passed down to the next generation. The children of these women, even if they didn't know the details of what their mothers had suffered, often perceived its effects. Mothers who could not show physical affection, mothers who reacted with terror to certain sounds or situations, mothers who kept secrets they would never reveal. My mother never told me what happened to her," wrote a son of a survivor, "but I knew. I knew from the way she tensed up when a man got too close to her, from the nightmares that woke her screaming, from the emptiness in her eyes when someone mentioned the war. I grew up with the ghost of a trauma that was never named. Now let's return to the fighting taking place on the streets of Berlin, where every building became a fortress and every corner a death trap. Urban warfare is the most brutal form of combat. There are no clear front lines. The enemy could be anywhere, in the building across the street, on the floor above, in the basement below. The confusion is total, and civilians, caught in the middle, suffer as much or more than the combatants. The Soviets had learned from their experiences in Stalingrad. They knew that advancing through the streets exposed was suicidal. Instead, they developed tactics that minimized their exposure to enemy fire. A Soviet training manual of the time described these tactics. Do not advance through the streets. Advance through the buildings. Tear down the interior walls. Use the sewer system. Attack from unexpected directions. The enemy expects you to come through the door. Surprise him by coming through the roof. These tactics worked, but they took a terrible toll on civilians. Buildings used as avenues of advance often collapsed, crushing those taking refuge in the basements. Grenades thrown to clear rooms did not distinguish between soldiers and non-combatants. A Soviet soldier named Grigory Pomerantsev described an incident that haunted him for years. We entered a basement we thought was empty. We threw a grenade before going in, like we'd been taught. When the smoke cleared, we found the bodies of a whole family, a mother, a father, 3 kids. They had been hiding there, waiting for the battle to pass, and we killed them. Pomerantsev wrote that this incident changed something in him. Before that, I could tell myself we were fighting against evil, that the Germans were the enemy. But those children weren't the enemy. They were innocent, and I killed them. That is the truth of war that nobody wants to hear, that we all turned into monsters. The German defenders, meanwhile, fought with the desperation of the doomed. They knew they couldn't win, but every hour they held out was another hour for civilians to escape west, one more hour of life before captivity or death. The SS units, especially, fought with a fanaticism that astounded even their enemies. For them, surrender was not an option. They had committed too many crimes during the war. They knew the Soviets would show them no mercy. An SS officer named Ernst Günther Kretschmer left a testimony of those days. We fought because we had nothing to lose. We knew what awaited us if we were captured. We had seen what our comrades had done in the East. We knew the Russians would treat us the same way. So we decided to die fighting. It was better than the alternative. But not all German defenders were SS fanatics. Many were simply ordinary soldiers, men who had been drafted against their will and just wanted to survive. For them, the Battle of Berlin was a nightmare from which there was no escape. Werner Adamczyk, a Wehrmacht soldier who survived the battle, described his experience. We were not heroes. We were survivors. We fought when we had to fight. We hid when we could hide, and we prayed for it all to end soon. Hitler had abandoned us. Germany had abandoned us. We only had each other. But what happened to the soldiers who tried to surrender? And how were prisoners of war treated in those chaotic final days? The testimonies reveal an extremely dangerous situation for those trying to lay down their arms. In the confusion of urban combat, gestures of surrender were often not recognized. Soviet soldiers, conditioned by years of propaganda and traumatized by what they had witnessed, sometimes shot first and asked questions later. A German soldier named Hans Schaffer described his attempt to surrender. I came out of the basement with my hands up, yelling, "Nicht schießen," don't shoot. The Russians saw me, and for a moment I thought everything would be fine, but then one of them raised his rifle. I felt the impact before I heard the shot. I realized I was lying on the ground, blood pouring from my shoulder. By some miracle, the shot didn't kill me. Another Russian, an officer, yelled something. and the others stopped shooting. They took me prisoner, but many of my comrades weren't so lucky. The German soldiers who were captured faced an uncertain fate. Many were sent to prisoner of war camps in the Soviet Union, where conditions were terrible. Mortality rates in these camps were extremely high, especially in the early post-war years. It is estimated that of the approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets, at least 1 million died in captivity. Many of the survivors were not released until years after the war ended, some not until 1955. A German prisoner named Helmut Goldwitzer, who would later write a book about his experience, described the conditions in the camps. We worked to the point of exhaustion. We ate barely enough to keep from starving. We slept in unheated barracks, even in the harshest winters. Many of my comrades died of disease, hunger, despair, but I survived. I don't know why. Maybe because I never lost hope of returning home. While German soldiers were captured and sent into captivity, the Soviet soldiers celebrated their victory. But the celebration was mixed with profound fatigue and uncertainty about the future. What awaited them after the war? Could they return to their homes, their families, their old lives? Or would the trauma of what they had experienced scar them forever? A Soviet soldier named Yuri Levitan, who participated in the capture of the Reichstag, reflected on the moment of victory. When we finally planted the flag over the Reichstag, I should have felt euphoric. But what I felt was empty, a huge emptiness. We had fought for 4 years for this moment. We had lost millions of comrades. And now that it had arrived, I didn't know what to feel. It was as if all the pain, all the suffering, all the fear I had repressed for years came out all at once. I sat in the rubble and cried. I cried for my dead friends, for my lost youth, for the world we had destroyed. Levitan survived the war and returned home to Ukraine. But like many veterans, he could never speak of his experiences. My family wanted me to tell them stories of heroism, he wrote decades later. But I didn't have stories of heroism to tell. I only had stories of horror, of guilt, of shame. So I kept silent, like all of us. The days immediately following the surrender were of indescribable chaos. The German government structure had disintegrated. The Soviets tried to impose order, but their troops, drunk on victory and alcohol, were hard to control, and millions of civilians tried to survive in a city with no water, no electricity, no food. The testimonies of those days reveal a mix of terror and relief. The terror of the ongoing rapes, the looting, the arbitrary violence, but also the relief that the bombings had stopped, that the end of the war was near, that maybe, just maybe, there would be a tomorrow. The author of A Woman in Berlin described the first days after the surrender. The silence is the first thing I noticed. After weeks of constant bombings and fighting, suddenly there was silence, a strange, unnatural silence, as if the whole city were holding its breath. And in that silence, slowly, we started to emerge from our shelters, to look at the destroyed world around us, to ask ourselves how to go on living. The reconstruction began almost immediately. The women of Berlin, known as Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, started clearing the millions of tons of debris covering the city. They worked barehanded, forming human chains to pass bricks hand to hand. It was exhausting work, but it was also an act of reconstruction, of hope, of defiance. Hildegard Neff, the actress who had survived the battle, described the Trümmerfrauen. They were the true heroines of the post-war period, women who had lost their husbands, their children, everything they had, and yet they went out every day to clear the rubble, to rebuild the city. No complaints, no self-pity, just work, work, work. Thanks to them, Berlin rose again. But physical reconstruction was only part of the challenge. Psychological, moral, and spiritual reconstruction would take much longer. The Germans had to confront what their country had done, the atrocities of the Holocaust, the destruction they had sown across Europe. and they had to do so while dealing with their own traumas, their own losses, their own wounds. How did the Germans process collective guilt? And how did this guilt affect subsequent generations? These questions have occupied historians, psychologists, and philosophers for decades. The answers are complex and often contradictory. In the early post-war years, many Germans adopted a stance of victimization. They saw themselves as victims of Nazism, not as perpetrators. This narrative was convenient because it allowed them to distance themselves from the regime's crimes without assuming personal responsibility. But starting in the 1960s, a new generation began to ask uncomfortable questions. What had their parents done during the war? How could they not have known about the Holocaust? Why hadn't they resisted? These questions, known in Germany as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, tore families and communities apart. A son of the post-war generation wrote about this confrontation. When I was 15, I found my father's SS uniform in the attic. I asked him what he had done during the war. He told me he had been a cook, but I knew it was a lie. We all knew it was a lie, and that lie stood between us like an invisible wall. The testimonies of the fall of Berlin are an essential part of this reckoning with the past, because they show us the complexity of history, the impossibility of dividing the world into simple categories of good and bad. The Soviet soldiers who liberated Europe from Nazism also committed atrocities. The German civilians who suffered the conquest had also supported, actively or passively, a criminal regime. The young Germans who died defending Berlin were victims of an indoctrination they had not chosen, but they were also perpetrators fighting for an evil cause. This complexity excuses nothing. It does not relativize the crimes of the Holocaust or minimize the atrocities committed by the Nazis, but it does force us to think more deeply about human nature, about how ordinary people can be drawn into committing or permitting extraordinarily evil acts. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who coined the term the banality of evil, wrote, "The most disturbing thing about the Nazi crimes was not that they were committed by monsters. It was that they were committed by perfectly normal people who loved their families, who enjoyed music, who believed they were doing the right thing. That is the most terrifying lesson of history." Let us now return to examine the final moments of Hitler's bunker in greater detail, for it is in those confined spaces where all the madness of the Third Reich condensed. The atmosphere in the depths of the Reich Chancellery during the final days of April was one of total surrealism. While the city burned above their heads, the bunker's occupants maintained a semblance of normalcy that bordered on the grotesque. Meals were served regularly on fine porcelain china. The aides wore their impeccable uniforms, and Hitler continued to preside over strategy meetings, where he moved non-existent divisions on increasingly fantastical maps. Traudl Jungner described this atmosphere. It was like living in a bubble, detached from reality. We could hear the explosions, feel the vibrations, but inside the bunker, everything continued, as if the war could still be won. Hitler talked about counteroffensives, about new weapons, about the arrival of reinforcements, and we nodded, even though we all knew it was madness. The bunker staff was divided into two clearly differentiated groups. On one side were the true believers, those who remained convinced that Hitler had a plan, that victory was possible, that death alongside the Führer was preferable to life without him. On the other side were the pragmatists, those who had lost all faith but stayed because they had nowhere to go, or because they feared the consequences of desertion. Gerda Christian, one of the secretaries, belonged to this second group. "I no longer believed in anything. I knew Hitler had led us to destruction, but I was afraid to leave. Those who tried to escape were shot as deserters. So I stayed, waiting for the end, praying to survive." Hitler's final days bore witness to a series of scenes that oscillated between the pathetic and the terrifying. The dictator, increasingly deteriorated physically and mentally, alternated between explosions of rage and episodes of self-pity. Heinz Linner, his valet, described the routine of those days. He got up late, sometimes at noon. He ate his breakfast while receiving reports on the military situation. He almost always reacted with anger, accusing his generals of treason. Then he presided over long meetings where he gave impossible orders. At night, he sometimes invited a few of us for tea. That was when he seemed most human, most vulnerable. But even in those moments, his hatred for the Jews and for those he considered his enemies did not diminish. A particularly revealing episode occurred on April 22nd, when Hitler finally accepted that Berlin was lost. During a military conference, when his generals informed him that the counter-offensive he had ordered had not materialized because the troops simply did not exist, Hitler suffered what witnesses described as a total collapse. Gerda Christian witnessed the scene. He started screaming, cursing, pounding the table with his fist. He said everyone had betrayed him, that Germany did not deserve to survive because it had proven to be weak, that he would stay in Berlin and die fighting. I had never seen him like that. It was as if the entire facade of control he had maintained for years crumbled all at once. After this collapse, Hitler's behaviour changed noticeably. He abandoned any pretense that the war could be won. Instead, he began to prepare for the end. The following days were marked by farewells, wills, and preparations for death. Hitler dictated his political testament, a document that revealed the depth of his fanaticism even at the very last moment. More than 30 years have passed since I volunteered for the First World War, the testament began. In those 3 decades, only love and loyalty to my people guided all my thoughts, actions, and my life. The document went on to blame international Jewry for the war, denying any responsibility for the Holocaust and demanding that Germany continue the fight against Bolshevism and Judaism. It was a perfect summary of the ideology that had caused the deaths of millions, delusions of grandeur, virulent anti-Semitism, and a complete inability to recognize his own crimes. Traudl Junge, who transcribed the will, reflected on the experience. As I wrote his words, I felt a mix of horror and disappointment. I hoped that in his final moments he would show some humanity, some regret, but there was none of that. Only hate, only blame for others, only the same poisonous rhetoric he had preached for 20 years. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun in a ceremony that was as brief as it was sad. The judge who officiated the wedding, a municipal official who had been pulled from a nearby shelter, could barely hide his nervousness. Rochus Misch, the bunker's telecommunications operator, witnessed part of the ceremony. It was very short, very cold. There were no flowers, no music, no joy. Just 2 people signing papers while outside the world was ending. When it finished, we toasted with champagne. Eva seemed happy, or at least relieved. I think for her, finally being Hitler's wife, even if only for a few hours, meant something. Eva Braun is one of the most enigmatic figures in Hitler's inner circle. She had been his companion for over 15 years, living in the shadows, known only to the dictator's closest circle. Her decision to remain in the bunker and die alongside Hitler has been interpreted in different ways, as an act of devoted love, as Stockholm Syndrome taken to the extreme, or simply as the decision of a woman who had lost all sense of self outside her relationship with the dictator. Traudl Junge recalled a conversation with Eva in those final days. She told me she would rather die here than live without him, that she couldn't bear to see the world after all this. I tried to convince her to escape, that there was still hope, but she refused. She was completely resigned to her fate. The final hours of April 30th were of unbearable tension for the bunker's occupants. Everyone knew the end was imminent. Soviet gunfire echoed closer and closer. The bunker's ventilation system failed intermittently, filling the air with suffocating heat, and Hitler, paler and shakier than ever, prepared for the final act. Around noon, Hitler said goodbye to his staff. He shook hands, murmured words of thanks, and then retired to his private rooms with Eva Braun. Heinz Linder recalled that moment. He told us the end had come, that his body must be incinerated, so the Russians couldn't display it as a trophy. Then he said goodbye to each of us. When he shook my hand, his eyes were empty. It was as if he were already dead. The following minutes were of agonizing wait. The bunker staff gathered in the corridor, listening in silence. Then, around 3:30 in the afternoon, they heard a gunshot. Otto Gunsch, Hitler's adjutant, who was waiting by the door, left a testimony of what he found. I opened the door and the smell of gunpowder hit me immediately. Hitler was sitting on the sofa, with his head slumped to the left. He had a hole in his right temple. The pistol was on the floor. Eva was next to him, motionless. There was no blood on her, only a grimace on her face. She had taken cyanide. The bodies were wrapped in blankets and carried to the Chancellery Garden, where they were placed in a bomb crater and doused with gasoline. As the aides set fire to the remains, Soviet shells fell all around them. Erich Kempka, Hitler's chauffeur, described the cremation. The flames rose quickly. The smell was horrible. We had to retreat several times to avoid the falling shells, but we kept pouring gasoline until there was none left. Even then, the bodies were not completely consumed. When we finally retreated to the bunker, you could still see the charred remains in the flames. What happened to Hitler's remains after the cremation? This question haunted historians for decades and fueled countless conspiracy theories. The Soviets found the partially burned remains a few days later. They moved them to different locations in the following weeks, conducting autopsies and confirming the identity of the corpses. But Stalin, for reasons he never fully explained, ordered that Hitler's death be kept a secret. For years, the Soviet regime hinted that Hitler might have escaped, fueling theories that the dictator was living in South America or in some other remote refuge. These theories, although absurd, served Stalin's propagandistic purposes. Only in 1968, after Stalin's death, did a Soviet historian named Lev Bezymensky publish the first official conclusions about Hitler's death. And only in 1970 were the remains of Hitler and Eva Braun finally destroyed by order of the KGB, incinerated and thrown into a river in East Germany. A Soviet officer who participated in this final cremation left a brief testimony. We burned the bones to ashes, then we threw the ashes into the river. We wanted to make sure nothing was left that could become a relic for neo-Nazis, that nothing at all was left of him. While Hitler's body burned, the tragedy of the Goebbels children unfolded in another corner of the bunker. Josef and Magda Goebbels had decided that their 6 children would die with them. For Magda, this decision seemed inevitable. She could not imagine a world where her children would live without National Socialism. To her, an existence without Hitler, without the Reich, without the ideology that had given meaning to her life, was worse than death. The children, who had lived a privileged existence as the model family of the Reich, did not understand what was happening. Helga, the eldest at 12, had shown signs of anxiety in the previous days, but the youngest, especially 4-year-old Haida, were too small to understand. Rochus Misch described the children in the bunker. They played in the corridors, oblivious to everything. Sometimes they would go up to sit on Hitler's lap. He seemed genuinely fond of them. It was strange to see him with the children, so different from his public image. But that doesn't redeem him of anything. Nothing redeems him. On the night of May 1st, after Hitler had committed suicide, Magda Goebbels carried out her terrible plan. Versions differ on the exact details, but most agree that an SS doctor, Ludwig Stumpfegger, helped administer sedatives to the children before they were given poison. A bunker nurse named Kata Heusmann left a testimony of that night. I heard Mrs. Goebbels go up to the children's rooms. She was up there for a long time. When she came down, she was pale but serene. She said nothing to anyone, but we all knew what she had done. After killing their children, Josef and Magda Goebbels went out to the Chancellery Garden. There, following the example of their Führer, they committed suicide. Their bodies were also incinerated, though even more incompletely than those of Hitler and Eva Braun. The Soviet soldiers who entered the bunker days later found the small bodies of the 6 Goebbels children. They were lying in their beds, dressed in their pajamas, as if they were simply sleeping. Only the bluish stains on their lips revealed the truth of what had happened. But what was happening in the streets of Berlin while these dramas unfolded underground? What were ordinary civilians experiencing while the Nazi leaders committed suicide in their bunkers? Dorothea von Schwanenflügel was 29 years old in April 1945. She was a waif and mother, living in Berlin with her young daughter. Her testimony, preserved for decades, offers one of the rawest glimpses of what civilians experienced during the fall of the city. While we were waiting in line at the grocery store, Dorothea wrote, I noticed a sad-looking boy across the street, standing behind some bushes in a shallow trench he had dug himself. I approached him and found a mere child in a uniform several sizes too big for him, with an anti-tank grenade at his side. The boy was crying. When Dorothea asked him what he was doing there, he lost his distrust and told her he had been ordered to wait in that spot, and when a Soviet tank approached, he was to run under it and detonate the grenade. I asked him how that would work, Dorothea continued, but he didn't know. In fact, this fragile child didn't even look capable of carrying such a grenade. It seemed like a useless suicide mission, because the Soviets would shoot him as soon as they saw him, before he could even get close to the tank. The boy sobbed and mumbled something, probably calling out to his mother in despair, and Dorothea could do nothing to help him. If she encouraged him to flee, he would be caught and hanged by the SS. If she gave him shelter in her home, everyone in the building would be shot. He was the picture of anguish, she wrote, created by our inhuman government. This testimony captures the essence of the tragedy of the Reich's final days. Children turned into cannon fodder by a regime that had lost all sense of humanity. When the Soviets finally reached Dorothea's neighborhood, the scene was terrifying. The Soviets fought the German soldiers and drafted civilians street by street until we could hear explosions and gunfire right in our immediate vicinity. As the noise got closer, we could even hear the horrible, guttural screams of the Soviet soldiers, who sounded to us like enraged animals. Gunfire shattered the windows of her house, shells exploded in her garden, and suddenly, the Soviets were on her street. It was a terrifying sight as they sat on their tanks with rifles cocked, aiming at the houses as they passed. The women shouting wielding weapons were the worst. Half the troops had nothing but rags and tatters around their feet, while others wore SS boots they had looted from a conquered barracks. That night, the occupants of Dorothea's building hid in the basement, paralyzed by fear. But her neighbors, a janitor couple who were apparently communists, went out to greet the Soviets, openly proclaiming their brotherhood with the liberators. Unsurprisingly, Dorothea wrote, that night a horde of Soviet soldiers returned and broke into their building. Then we heard what sounded like a terrible orgy, with women screaming for help, many shrieking at the same time. The uproar gave me goosebumps. Some of the Soviets trampled our garden and beat on the doors with the butts of their rifles, trying to get in. Thanks to the solid wooden doors, the Soviets could not enter Dorothea's shelter, but other families were not so lucky. Gerda Droes was a teenager during the Battle of Berlin. Her testimony offers another perspective on those apocalyptic days. Gerda was trying to return home when the Soviet offensive was in full swing. Artillery shells were falling on both sides of the road. Soviet multiple rocket launchers, known as Stalin's organs, fired rocket after rocket. Gerda could see the trails of the rockets flying overhead, heading toward the center of Berlin. When I left the soldiers to head to my neighborhood, she recalled, I saw one of my relatives pushing a baby carriage toward me with her 2 little girls. She was trying to get to her parents' house. She yelled at me as she passed, "Watch out! Watch out! They're shooting at us!" There were shells falling all around us. Gerda managed to make it to her home in Wittenau, a suburb on the northwestern edge of the city. The door was locked and no one was there. She took refuge in the basement they used as an air raid shelter. Suddenly, the trapdoor opened and it was my father. My family had moved to the nearby bunker. They were convinced I had died. The family remained in the bunker for days while the fighting raged outside. They did not know what the future held for them. They were also worried about Gerda's older brother, Heinz, who was fighting with the German army on the Eastern Front. But what was life like inside those bunkers where hundreds of thousands of Berliners sought refuge? And what happened when the Soviets finally found them? The bunker where Gerda's family took shelter was one of many dotting the city. Some were massive concrete structures holding thousands of people. Others were simply reinforced basements. All became temporary communities where strangers shared terror, hunger, and hope. We didn't have enough food for everyone, Gerda recalled, so 3 men from the bunker sneaked out and came back with a sack of flour. I decided to try and get flour from the nearby bread factory. When I left the bunker, I realized the Russians were on the roof of a nearby school. I could hear bullets whistling. Gerda managed to reach the factory, where the owner gave her a small sack of flour, which she took back to the bunker. When I think about it today, she reflected, I can't believe how stupid I was. Finally, on May 5th, the shooting outside ceased. The refugees were terrified of what would come next. The Russian soldiers broke down the door and entered the bunker. They said 2 words in German, "Women, come." Then our neighbour's mother was raped. It was horrible. They kept several women inside the bunker, but while they were busy, some of us, including my family, managed to escape. Gerda and her family thought they would be shot the moment they crossed the door. There were bodies everywhere, both German and Russian. They ran across a field towards their home, passing through trenches dug by the German defenders. At the entrance to our neighbourhood was a huge trench we had to crawl through, but we made it home safe and sound, and my father hid us in the basement, covering the trapdoor with rugs and blankets. Dorothea von Schwanenflügel's testimony continues, with a description of the first days of the Soviet occupation that reveals both the chaos and the cruelty of those moments. We felt paralysed by the sight of these burly Mongols, who looked savage and terrifying. In the ruins across the street, the first Soviet orders were posted, including a curfew. Suddenly, there was a deafening noise outside. Horrified, we watched the Soviets demolish the corner grocery store and throw its contents, shelves, and furniture into the street. Sacks of flour, sugar, and rice, so urgently needed, were torn open and their contents spilled onto the bare pavement. Soviet soldiers stood guard with their rifles, so no one would dare pick up the food being wasted. This was simply unbelievable. At night, some desperate people tried to rescue some of the spilled food from the gutter. Hunger now became a major concern because our ration cards were worthless, with no hope of receiving supplies. Shortly after, there was another commotion outside. Worse than before. The Soviets had broken into the bank and were looting it. They came out shouting joyfully with their hands full of German banknotes and jewellery from the safe deposit boxes that had been forced open. Thank God we had already withdrawn money and had it at home. General Helmut Weidlin, commander of the German troops in Berlin, finally surrendered the entire city to the Soviet army on May 2nd, 1945. There was no radio or newspapers, so trucks with loudspeakers roamed the streets, ordering an end to all resistance. Suddenly, Dorothea wrote, the shooting and bombing stopped, and the unreal silence meant that one nightmare had ended for us, and another was about to begin. All of Berlin, the 300 square kilometres left of the city, was now completely under the control of the Red Army. The final days of savage house-to-house fighting and street battles had been a human massacre, with no prisoners taken by either side. These final days were hell. Our last exhausted troops, mainly children and old men, fell prisoner. We were a city in ruins. Hardly any house remained intact. But what happened to those who tried to desert or surrender before the official capitulation? How did the Nazi regime treat those who wanted to end the slaughter? The testimonies reveal a chilling reality. The Nazi regime, even in its final death throes, maintained a terrifying grip on the population through summary executions. Werner Eckert, who experienced the Battle of Berlin as a child, was shocked by the cruelty shown by the Nazis toward deserters. Anyone who put on a white armband to surrender was hanged by the SS. I saw them hanging there. For one of them, I even had to write a sign saying, "I am a coward." I wanted to hand the German Reich over to communism. In the Steglitz town hall, a man named Friedrich Schwertz was hanged after hoisting a white flag from his window. In Schöneberg, a German soldier was hung from a lamppost, with a sign around his neck reading, "I, Sergeant Lehmann, was too much of a coward to defend women and children." Ernst Kleiner, a 19-year-old Luftwaffe member at the time, summed up the situation. Deserting was never an option. It meant the death penalty. These public executions served as a warning to others, but they also revealed the desperation of a regime that knew its end was near. The Nazis preferred to kill their own people rather than allow an orderly surrender. And what about daily life during those apocalyptic days? How did Berliners survive while their world crumbled around them? For many Berliners, the morning of April 22nd seemed like any other wartime morning. The weather was cloudy, the shops were still open, and rations were still being distributed. 200 grams of bread, 36 grams of meat, 18 grams of lard. But overnight, life changed immeasurably. The subway lines stopped running, newspapers stopped printing, and soon, starving Berliners were raiding bakeries and vegetable shops searching for food that was no longer being rationed. The atmosphere in the city was apocalyptic. From the Führer bunker, Hitler and his regime sought to prolong the war for as long as possible, even at the expense of the inhabitants of Berlin. Even children and the elderly were forced to defend the city, mostly poorly equipped. By April 25th, conditions had drastically worsened, with no electrical supply, a collapsed food system, and failing water and sewage systems. There was massive hunger and an increased risk of epidemics. The bombings that preceded the ground battle had been devastating on their own. Gerda Drews also survived those nocturnal air raids and left a testimony of that experience. The warning system was very well defined, she recalled. We would listen to the radio and it would say, "Bombers, coming from Hanover Braunschweig." Then we knew Berlin was the target of the bombing. We had no electricity, but we had an old battery-operated crystal radio, and we had to move the crystal to tune into the station. During the bombings, Gerda's family took shelter in a bunker that could hold 200 people. It contained a honeycomb of small rooms, each with a pair of bunk beds and 2 benches to sit on. There were also full kitchens and bathrooms. As the attacks continued, some people lived there permanently because they no longer had homes. When the final alarm sounded, you could already see the Christmas trees, the coloured flares dropped by Pathfinder planes, to mark the target for the bombers. You could see the searchlights rising from the ground, looking for the planes. The city was surrounded by a ring of white light. Outside the bunker, you could hear the whistle of the bombs as they fell through the air, then the explosions when they hit, and then see the fireballs rising. Inside the bunker, you could hear the explosions. Once the bunker was almost hit, and they felt it move. We knew that if there was a direct hit from a large bomb, we would all die. The only people inside were women, children, and old people. During an attack, everyone was terrified. Mothers hugged their children, and children hugged their mothers. People cried and prayed out loud. One of Gerda's most disturbing memories was what she saw after one of the bombings. When we came out of our basement, we went to see where the bomb had fallen. Then we saw one of the neighbours. He was dead. It was a truly terrifying sight, because the concussion had mutilated him, and his eyes were hanging out of his head. It was one of those images I will never forget. Another day, there was a daytime bombing, and the workers went to the bunker. When they returned to work, they found their factory was a pile of rubble. There was no transportation, so Gerda had to walk home. The entire street was on fire, every building on both sides of the street, and the air was so hot that people could only stand it if they walked down the middle of the street. The phosphorus from the incendiary bombs ran down the outside of the buildings and caught fire. They looked like fiery snakes. The worst part was what Gerda could hear. You could hear the screams of people inside the buildings who were trapped and burning to death. It was terrible. I can still hear their screams when I think about it. How much did German civilians know about the real progress of the war? And how did that ignorance affect their ability to prepare for what was coming? Gerda reflected on this point. They really kept us in the dark about the progress of the war. It's hard to believe today how little we knew. We listened to the radio, but it was all propaganda. About 10 times a day, there was a special bulletin, always positive, announcing some German advance or victory. At her workplace, there was a group of women who sat apart, and whenever you approached them, they stopped talking. Gerda now believes they were saying negative things about the Nazis and didn't want anyone to hear them. This combination of constant propaganda and terror toward any dissent kept the German population in a state of ignorance until the very last moment. Many Berliners genuinely didn't know how desperate the situation was until the Soviets were literally in their streets. When the battle finally ended, the monumental task of rebuilding the city began. And this task fell mainly on the women. It was monumental work, Gerda recalled, because the rubble from the streets had to be removed by hand. All the tram lines were down, and everywhere there were charred remains of wooden tram cars. The defenders had used them as barricades, so of course they were destroyed. Most of the work was done by the women. Gerda's mother and she herself collected rubble, as did all their female relatives. It was hard work, chipping all the mortar off the bricks by hand so they could be used again. These women, known as Trümmerfrauen, or women of the rubble, became symbols of German reconstruction. They worked long hours for minimal food rations, clearing the millions of tons of debris covering the city. Their silent, grueling labour laid the foundation for the rebuilding of Berlin. But Gerda's tragedy did not end with the conclusion of the war. On August 10th, 1945, her father received orders to report to the local police station. 2 men came to the door and told Gerda's mother to bring a suitcase full of clothes, as her father was being taken to the countryside to help with the autumn harvest. We hastily packed the suitcase and took it to the police station. At the back of the station, we could see men being loaded into the back of trucks and taken away. People were crying and calling out to each other. Gerda jumped on her bicycle and followed the trucks, along with hundreds of other people frantically trying to see where the trucks were going. Eventually, the Russians dispersed the crowds with gunfire. Gerda never saw her father again. Only years later, a man who had been in the same prison camp told her what had happened. Her father had been working in the camp kitchen when he contracted dysentery and died in 1947. The man wrote down the details and signed the paper, so Gerda's mother could collect a small widow's pension. The camp where Gerda's father died was Sachsenhausen, in Soviet-occupied Germany. It held approximately 150,000 political prisoners from 1945 to 1950, a third of whom died in captivity. What do these testimonies teach us about the nature of war and human suffering? And why is it important to listen to these voices 80 years later? The testimonies of Dorothea, Gerda, and other survivors revealed truths that statistics could never capture. They show us the terror of a mother unable to protect her child, the horror of seeing neighbours hanged for trying to surrender, the desperation of searching for food among the rubble while bullets whistle past your head. But they also show us human resilience, women who lost everything and still rose every day to clear the rubble, families who protected each other against impossible odds, individuals who maintained their humanity, even as the world around them crumbled. Now we must examine the testimonies of the Soviet soldiers who conquered Berlin, for their voices complete the picture of this shared tragedy. For the Red Army, the capture of Berlin was the ultimate objective of 4 years of brutal war. Millions of Soviets had died fighting the Germans. Entire cities had been leveled. Whole families had been exterminated. And now, finally, the Soviet soldiers were about to enter the enemy's lair. But along with the desire for victory, there was also a thirst for revenge that troubled even some Soviet commanders. The soldiers had seen too much, suffered too much, and when they entered German territory, many of them stopped seeing the Germans as human beings. A Soviet correspondent travelling with the army left this testimony. The men were drunk with victory, but also with something darker. They had been repressing their anger for years. They had seen their families murdered, their villages burned, their comrades die in the most horrible ways. And now that they finally had the chance to get revenge, many of them took it. This revenge took terrible forms. The mass rapes that occurred during the conquest of Berlin were one of the most extensive war crimes in history, but it would be unfair to condemn the entire Red Army for the acts of some. Many Soviet soldiers behaved with dignity and even risked their lives to protect German civilians. The moment of final victory arrived when the Soviet flag was hoisted over the Reichstag. This image became one of the most iconic symbols of the 20th century, although the story behind the photograph is more complicated than it seems. Several groups of Soviet soldiers attempted to plant flags on the Reichstag during the fighting. Many of them died in the attempt. When the fighting finally ended, photographer Yevgeny Kaldai created the famous image we know today. But this image was a construct. Kaldai had brought the flag from Moscow, made by his tailor using red tablecloths. The photograph was taken after the fighting had ended, with soldiers posing for the camera, and before its publication, Soviet censors retouched the image to eliminate evidence of looting. This manipulation does not detract from the historical importance of the capture of the Reichstag, but it reminds us that even the most authentic moments of history can be constructs, products of propaganda and politics. The final surrender of Germany occurred on May 8, 1945, in a small schoolhouse in Reims, France. An American correspondent who witnessed the ceremony left this testimony. In the courtyard, a window suddenly opened on the ground floor. A block of yellow light fell to the ground, silhouetting the figures of some people standing by the wall. Instantly, they crowded forward. Towards the window, 2 men appeared. One of them said, "There are sandwiches and some Coca-Colas here." "What's going on in there?" "I can't say," the man at the window said. "It was supposed to be at 10 o'clock. It's past 12 already." "Well, there hasn't been a peep from anyone." Finally, the Germans entered the room. They were Colonel General Jodl, Chief of the Wehrmacht, Admiral General von Friedeberg, Commander of the German Navy, and Major Oxenius, an aide. The correspondent described Jodl. He was not a sympathetic figure. The hardness and iron of the Prussians was stamped in every curve of his body and in every inflexible line of his face. Here was the personification of blood and iron. Men like this had unleashed rivers of blood and made the nights hideous with screams. With the signing of the surrender, the Second World War in Europe officially came to an end. But for the millions of survivors, the suffering was just beginning. What happened to Berlin after the war? And how did the division of the city affect those who had survived the battle? Gerda Droz lived to see another tragedy, the construction of the Berlin Wall. On August 13th, 1961, when my children were still small, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall and divided our city in two. The wall went up at the end of our street, just a few blocks away. Fortunately for Gerda, her home was on the western side, but they lost contact with their friends and relatives on the other side, in East Germany. The wall was a constant reminder of the Soviet presence. For many Berliners, the wall represented the continuation of their nightmare. They had survived the war, rebuilt their city from the rubble, and now saw their home split in two by a barrier of concrete and barbed wire. The places where the Battle of Berlin occurred still exist today, although transformed by decades of reconstruction and memory. Bullet holes and scars of war are still visible on some buildings. Memorials and cemeteries remember the millions who died, and the bunkers, though mostly demolished or sealed, remain as silent witnesses to the catastrophe. The house at Schulenburgerin 2, where General Weidlind signed the surrender of Berlin on the living room table of a woman named Annie Goebbels, still exists. A plaque on its wall is the only reminder of this momentous event in world history. The Reichstag, rebuilt and renovated, is now the seat of the reunified German parliament. Tourists climb to its glass dome, designed by architect Norman Foster, and look down upon a city that rose from the ashes. Few of them think about the hundreds of soldiers who died fighting for that building in April 1945. The voices of those who were at the fall of Berlin speak to us across the decades. They tell us stories of terror and survival, of cruelty and compassion, of destruction and reconstruction. They remind us that history is not just dates and statistics, but real people with lives, families, hopes and fears. Dorothea von Schwanenflügel, the young mother who saw a child soldier crying in a trench, survived the war and left her testimony for future generations. Gerda Druss, the teenager who walked through burning streets listening to the screams of people burning alive, lived to see the reunification of Germany, and thousands of other survivors, whose names we will never know, also left their footprints on history. Their testimonies teach us that war is not glorious, that violence always has a human cost, that civilians are always the main victims of armed conflicts, and that remembering the past is the only way to prevent it from repeating. But the history of the fall of Berlin also teaches us something about human resilience, about the capacity of people to rebuild their lives after catastrophe, to find hope amidst despair, to forgive though never forget. The women of the rubble who cleaned Berlin brick by brick, the survivors who rebuilt their families and their communities, the former enemies who eventually reconciled, they all demonstrated that the human spirit, though it may be temporarily crushed, can never be completely destroyed. This is the most important lesson of the fall of Berlin, that even in the darkest moments of history, the light of humanity continues to shine, that even when all seems lost, there is always hope, and that the voices of those who suffered deserve to be heard, remembered, and honoured. Now we must delve deeper into the experiences of the combatants on both sides, as their testimonies reveal the true nature of urban warfare. The Battle of Berlin was unique in military history for its intensity and brutality. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers attacked a city, defended by a desperate mix of regular troops, elderly militiamen, and child soldiers. The fighting lasted over 2 weeks and left the city virtually unrecognizable. For the Soviet soldiers, the advance through Berlin was a nightmare of hidden dangers. Every building could hide snipers. Every basement could hold fanatical defenders. Every corner could be an ambush. A Soviet sergeant left this testimony of the fighting. We advanced building by building, room by room. We threw a grenade before entering any space. We shot first and asked questions later. There was no other way to survive. The Germans fought like demons. They knew they had nothing to lose. Soviet tanks, which had been so effective in open field battles, became vulnerable targets in the narrow streets of Berlin. German defenders, armed with Panzerfausts, waited on the upper floors of buildings. As a tank passed, they fired from above, where the armour was weakest. A Soviet tanker recalled, "We lost tanks every day. The Germans shot at us from the rooftops, from the windows, from the basements. We couldn't see them until it was too late. Many of my comrades burned to death inside their tanks. But what motivated the German defenders to keep fighting when everything was clearly lost? And what went through the minds of the child soldiers who had been sent to die? The testimonies reveal a complex mix of fanaticism, fear, and desperation. For the SS members, surrender was not an option. They had committed too many crimes during the war. They knew the Soviets would show them no mercy. They preferred to die fighting rather than face justice for their acts. For the regular soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the situation was different. Many of them had lost all faith in victory months ago, but they kept fighting because they had no alternative. Deserting meant death at the hands of the SS. Surrendering meant an uncertain fate at the hands of the Soviets. And behind them were their families, who depended on every hour the defenders could win. For the children of the Volkssturm and the Hitler Youth, the situation was even more tragic. Many of them had been indoctrinated since childhood to believe in Hitler and in National Socialism. They knew no other reality. And when they were given a weapon and told to defend their homeland, many obeyed without question. But other children were simply terrified. The testimony Dorothea von Schwanenflügel left about the child soldier crying in his trench perfectly captures this tragedy. These were not fanatical warriors. They were frightened children, sent to die by adults who had lost all humanity. The most intense fighting occurred around the government buildings in the center of Berlin. The Reichstag, the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's bunker. These places became the stages for the final acts of the war in Europe. The assault on the Reichstag, in particular, became a symbol of the Soviet victory. Stalin had specifically ordered that the red flag fly over its dome for the 1st of May, and his soldiers were willing to pay any price to fulfill that order. The fighting inside the Reichstag lasted almost 2 days. The defenders, a few hundred SS soldiers and sailors, fought to the last man. The Soviets had to conquer the building floor by floor, room by room, using grenades and machine gun fire. A Soviet soldier who participated in the assault left this testimony. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see a meter away. The noise was deafening. You tripped over corpses at every step. And the Germans kept shooting, kept resisting, even when it was clear all was lost. When the flag was finally planted over the Reichstag, the Soviet soldiers who achieved it were exhausted, covered in blood and dust, almost in disbelief that they had survived. What did those soldiers feel in the moment of victory? And what price did they pay for having achieved it? The testimonies reveal a mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, sadness for fallen comrades, and a strange emptiness that many did not expect. A Soviet officer wrote, "I should have felt euphoric. We had achieved what seemed impossible. But what I felt was empty, a huge emptiness. So many dead friends, so much destruction. For what?" Another soldier recalled, "I looked around and saw the faces of my comrades. They were as exhausted as I was. Some were crying. Others simply sat in silence, staring at nothing. There was no celebration. There was no joy, just relief that it was finally over." The cost of victory had been immense. It is estimated that over 80,000 Soviet soldiers died in the Battle of Berlin, with another 250,000 wounded. For each of the survivors, the victory was tainted by the memory of the friends who had not survived. And for the civilians of Berlin, the end of the fighting did not mean the end of the suffering. The first weeks of the Soviet occupation were marked by chaos, violence, and hunger. The mass rapes that occurred during this period left scars that would last generations. Looting left many families with nothing. An uncertainty about the future weighed on everyone. But gradually, very gradually, life began to normalize. The Soviets imposed order. Food distribution points were established. The rubble began to be cleared. And the Berliners, with the tenacity that would characterize them in the following decades, began to rebuild. The history of Berlin after the war is a history of division and eventual reunification. For over 4 decades, the city was divided in two: West Berlin, an enclave of freedom surrounded by communist territory, and East Berlin, the capital of the German Democratic Republic. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, became the most visible symbol of the Cold War. Families separated, friends divided, a city split in two by a scar of concrete and barbed wire. But on November the 9th, 1989, the wall fell. Berliners from both sides, many with tears in their eyes, crossed the borders that had separated them for generations. It was the end of an era and the beginning of another. Today, Berlin is a transformed city. The buildings destroyed in 1945 have been rebuilt or replaced. The spaces that were once filled with rubble are now parks, squares, and modern office complexes. And the generation that survived the war is fading away, taking with them their memories of those terrible days. But the testimonies remain. The words of Dorothea von Schwanenflegel, of Gerda Drews, of the Soviet and German soldiers who fought and died in those streets, continue to speak to us across the decades. They remind us of what happened. They warn us of what can happen again if we forget the lessons of the past. What can we learn from the fall of Berlin? And why do these voices from the past still matter today? The first lesson is about the dangers of extremism. Nazism led Germany to total destruction. Millions died for the ambitions of a regime that promised greatness, but delivered only death and misery. The testimonies of those who lived through those days remind us that ideology can blind people, making them commit or tolerate unimaginable acts. The second lesson is about the universality of suffering. In the fall of Berlin, everyone suffered. The Soviet soldiers who died conquering the city, the German soldiers who died defending it, the civilians caught in the middle. Suffering does not distinguish between nationalities or ideologies. Everyone bleeds the same. The third lesson is about the moral complexity of war. In Berlin, there were no absolute good guys or absolute bad guys. There were victims who were also perpetrators. There were perpetrators who were also victims. There were acts of unimaginable cruelty and acts of unexpected kindness. The reality of war is more complex than any simple narrative can capture. And the fourth lesson is about the importance of memory. The testimonies of those who were at the fall of Berlin are an invaluable legacy for future generations. They allow us to understand what really happened, beyond the statistics and the dates. They force us to confront the reality of human suffering, and they remind us that we must do everything possible to prevent such tragedies from repeating. When I think of the fall of Berlin, I don't think of the generals or the military strategies. I think of the child soldier crying in his trench. I think of the women who heard screams in the night. I think of the soldiers on both sides who died far from their families. I think of the mothers who searched for their children among the rubble. These are the voices that deserve to be heard. These are the stories that deserve to be told. And this is the memory we must preserve, so that future generations understand the true cost of war. The fall of Berlin was not just a military event. It was a human tragedy of biblical proportions. Millions of lives destroyed, millions of families separated, millions of broken hearts. And yet, from those ruins, something new emerged. A rebuilt city, a transformed nation, a Europe that, despite all its imperfections, has lived in peace for generations. That is perhaps the most important lesson of all, that even from the most complete destruction, hope can emerge. That even after the darkest nights, the sun rises again. That the human spirit, although it can be temporarily crushed, can never be completely destroyed. Now let's delve into the testimonies of those who witnessed the final hours of the Third Reich from inside the bunker, where reality and fantasy mixed in disturbing ways. The occupants of the Führer bunker lived in a world completely disconnected from the reality on the surface. While Berlin burned above their heads, they continued with routines that seemed drawn from another time, another place. Meals were served regularly. Secretaries typed up documents no one would read. generals studied maps of a Reich that no longer existed, and Hitler, increasingly physically and mentally deteriorated, presided over meetings where counter-offensives with phantom armies were planned. Heinz Linder, Hitler's valet, left one of the most detailed accounts of those final days. The Führer woke up late, often after noon. He ate his breakfast while receiving reports on the military situation. He almost always reacted with anger, accusing his generals of incompetence or treason. He never accepted that the situation was irreversible. He always found someone else to blame. The daily routine of the bunker had a surreal quality. Secretaries took dictation for meaningless documents. Cooks prepared meals with increasingly scarce ingredients. Guards stood watch at doors that no longer protected anything. And above all hung the smell of concrete, sweat, and fear. One of the most revealing testimonies comes from Traudl Junger, the young secretary who was with Hitler until the end. Her memoirs, published decades after the war, offer a unique window into the dictator's psychology in his final days. Hitler was a completely different person from what he had been years before, Junger recalled. Physically, he was destroyed. His left hand shook constantly. He walked hunched over. His voice, which had once mesmerized multitudes, was now barely a hoarse whisper. But the most disturbing aspect was his mental state. Hitler alternated between moments of lucidity and episodes of complete disconnection from reality. Sometimes he acknowledged the war was lost. Other times he spoke of future victories as if they were certainties. One night, Junger remembered, he called me to dictate a document. It was about plans for the reconstruction of Berlin after the war. He described in detail the new buildings that would be built, the monuments that would be erected, the avenues that would be widened. As he dictated, we could hear the explosions outside. The city he described no longer existed, but he didn't seem to notice. How did the other occupants of the bunker react to Hitler's deterioration? And what did they feel as they waited for what seemed to be an inevitable end? The testimonies reveal a variety of responses. Some remained loyal to the end, convinced that dying beside the Führer was the highest honor possible. Others desperately looked for a way to escape, and many simply waited, paralyzed by uncertainty and fear. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, was among those seeking an escape. Although he publicly professed absolute loyalty, in private he made plans to flee when the time came. His escape attempts would end in failure and death, but they reveal that even those closest to Hitler had their own survival instincts. Joseph Goebbels, on the other hand, was determined to die. The propaganda minister had tied his fate to Hitler's from the beginning. And when it became clear that all was lost, he made the most horrific decision imaginable, to kill his own children before killing himself. Eva Braun, Hitler's companion for over 15 years, faced the end with a serenity that surprised many. She had chosen to remain in the bunker when she could have escaped, and when the moment came, she took her poison without hesitation. The final days in the bunker bore witness to scenes that oscillated between the grotesque and the tragic. Weddings, suicides, murders, farewells, everything was compressed into a span of a few days, creating a drama that defies imagination. The wedding of Hitler and Eva Braun, held on April 29, 1945, was one of the most surreal moments. Amidst a destroyed city, surrounded by death and destruction, two people married in a brief and sad civil ceremony. Rochus Misch, the telecommunications operator who witnessed the ceremony, recalled, "It was very strange. The judge arrived nervous, not really knowing what to do. Hitler and Eva were calm, almost resigned. They signed the papers. They kissed briefly, and that was it. There was no music, no flowers, no joy, just the feeling that something was ending." After the ceremony, there was a small toast with champagne. Those present congratulated the newlyweds, while outside Soviet shells fell on the Chancellery gardens. It was a scene of absolute unreality. The next day, April 30th, Hitler and Eva retired to their private rooms to die together. Those waiting outside heard a gunshot. When they opened the door, they found exactly what they expected. Hitler dead from a gunshot to the temple, Eva dead from cyanide. The bodies were carried to the garden and burned, following the instructions Hitler had left. He did not want the Soviets to exhibit his corpse as they had exhibited Mussolini's. Otto Günscher, the adjutant who oversaw the cremation, left this testimony. "We doused the bodies with gasoline and set them on fire. The flames rose quickly. We had to step back several times to avoid the shells falling around us. But we kept pouring gasoline until there was none left. When we finally retreated to the bunker, you could still see the charred remains in the flames. Hitler's death marked the symbolic end of the Third Reich, but the real end would take several more days to arrive. What happened in the bunker after Hitler's death? And how did the survivors try to escape? With the Führer's death, the command structure of the bunker disintegrated. Some occupants decided to try and escape to the west. Others chose to commit suicide, and a few simply waited for the Soviets to arrive. On the night of May 1st to 2nd, several groups tried to break through the Soviet lines. They left the bunker and ventured into the ruins of Berlin, hoping to find a gap in the enemy encirclement. Most of them were captured or killed. Very few managed to escape. Martin Bormann was one of those who tried to flee. His body was found decades later near a train station in Berlin, suggesting he died during the escape attempt. He probably bit a cyanide capsule when it became clear he could not escape. Other bunker occupants chose a different fate. Magda Goebbels poisoned her 6 children before committing suicide with her husband. The generals and officers who remained were captured by the Soviets and subjected to extensive interrogations. For the Soviets, the capture of Hitler's bunker was a moment of triumph, but also of frustration. They wanted to capture Hitler alive, to exhibit him as a trophy of war. Instead, they found only ashes and corpses. Hitler's remains were identified through his dental records. A dental assistant to the dictator, Kata Heusermann, was forced to identify the teeth the Soviets had found among the charred remains. Her testimony confirmed that the body was indeed Hitler's. But Stalin was not satisfied. For years, the Soviet dictator insinuated that Hitler might have escaped, fueling conspiracy theories that would persist for decades. Only long after Stalin's death was the full truth about Hitler's fate revealed. The dictator's remains were moved to different locations by the Soviets, subjected to autopsies, and finally destroyed in 1970. According to reports, the bones were incinerated and the ashes thrown into a river in East Germany. The goal was to ensure that nothing remained that could become a relic for neo-Nazis. This is all for this part of the story. The fall of Berlin, told through the voices of those who were there, reveals truths that history books rarely capture. The terror of civilians trapped between 2 armies, the desperation of defenders fighting for a lost cause, the thirst for revenge of conquerors who had suffered so much, and the madness of the leaders who had brought the world to catastrophe. But it also reveals the resilience of the human spirit, the women who cleared the rubble, the survivors who rebuilt their lives, the former enemies who eventually found a way to live in peace. If you made it this far, I ask you to stay with me. There are more voices to hear, more testimonies to discover, more lessons to learn. In the next part, we will explore the experiences of prisoners of war, raped women, orphaned children, and soldiers who had to live with what they had seen and done. Do you want to know what happened to the survivors in the following years? How did they process the trauma? How did they rebuild their lives? Let us know in the comments. Until the next video.